The air above the harbour was still. It had been still for most of the afternoon and into the early evening, the kind of stillness that settles over a city when the wind has tired of pushing against the rooftops and spires and has gone somewhere else entirely, perhaps out to the open water beyond the headlands. In this stillness, the air held things. It held the faint salt of the bay, a salt that was not the sharp, clean salt of the deep ocean, but something softer and more complicated, a salt mixed with the memory of freshwater creeks that emptied into the tidal flats and with the fine dark silt that the current stirred up from the bottom twice a day. The air also held the breath of the city itself. From 1,000 chimneys rose thin columns of smoke, most of them pale grey against the pale grey sky, and these columns did not blow away in any particular direction, but simply rose a certain distance and then flattened out, spreading into a haze that hung over the rooftops like a second layer of cloud, sitting lower and heavier than the one that had been overhead since morning. This smoke carried with it the fine particles of soft coal that had not quite finished burning, tiny black specks smaller than the eye could see individually, but collectively visible as a slight darkening of the air. These specks were carbon mostly, with traces of sulfur and ash, and the microscopic remains of whatever else had been in the coal seam when it was dug from the ground 100 miles away. They floated on the still air, and they waited. High above this layer of smoke and city haze, there was another layer of air that moved more freely, though still not with any great purpose or speed. This was the air that had come in from the sea earlier in the week, a broad, slow-moving body of marine air that had travelled across the cold northern waters for days before arriving at this coastline. It was a moist air. It had picked up moisture from the surface of the ocean through the steady, patient process of evaporation, a process that had been going on for as long as the sun had been warming the sea and the wind had been stirring its surface. Each square mile of ocean gave out countless gallons of water to the air above it every day, not in a rush or a dramatic transfer, but in a quiet, continuous exhalation that no one noticed and no one measured, except in the abstract way that scientists in distant universities wrote about in papers that very few people ever read. This water rose as vapor, individual molecules of H2O breaking free from the liquid surface and joining the gases of the atmosphere, moving from a state of relative order among their fellow molecules to a state of much greater freedom and much greater dispersion. A single water molecule in the liquid ocean was surrounded on all sides by other water molecules, held in place by the weak electrical attractions that bind water to itself, and it vibrated and jostled within that crowded community without ever really going anywhere. A water molecule that escaped into the air was different. It was alone, or nearly alone, separated from its neighbors by vast distances in molecular terms and free to move in any direction that the random collisions with nitrogen and oxygen molecules pushed it. It was this freedom that allowed the air to carry moisture from the sea to the land, from the warm places to the cool places, from the low places to the high places. The marine air that sat over the harbour on this particular afternoon had been carrying its burden of water vapour for several days and had not yet been asked to give any of it up. The vapour was invisible and odourless and weightless to any human sense, but it was there in enormous quantities. A cubic metre of this air contained perhaps 20 grams of water in gaseous form, which is not very much by the standards of a drinking glass, but which adds up considerably when one considers the millions upon millions of cubic meters that made up the air mass sitting over the city and the bay. The water was there, waiting for something to change. The thing that needed to change was the temperature. Warm air can hold more water vapor than cold air can, a fact that is well known to anyone who has ever seen dew form on a glass of cold water on a warm day. The air near the glass cools and can no longer keep its moisture dissolved in the gaseous state, and so the moisture condenses out onto the surface of the glass in tiny droplets. The same principle governed the air over the harbour. As long as the air remained warm, the water vapour stayed where it was, invisible and unremarkable. But the afternoon was wearing on, and the sun, hidden though it was behind the high thin overcast, was sinking toward the rooftops. The angle of its light was growing longer and more orange, and less effective at warming the ground and the air above it. The heat that had accumulated in the brick and stone and slate of the city during the day was slowly radiating back out into the sky, and the air temperature was beginning to drop, not quickly and not dramatically, but steadily, a degree or two over the course of an hour, a slow, gentle slide toward the cooler temperatures of the coming night. As the air cooled, its capacity to hold water vapor diminished. The relative humidity, which is simply a measure of how full the air is compared to how full it could be, began to climb. When the air had been warm, it might have been at 60% saturation, meaning it contained a little more than half of the water it could theoretically hold. As the temperature dropped, that percentage crept upward. 62%, 65%, 70%. The average survives most to the everyday heroes. The ceiling was coming down, so to speak, and the room was feeling more crowded. At some point, the temperature would reach the dew point, which is the temperature at which the air becomes completely saturated and can hold no more water in vapor form. When that happens, something must give, and what gives is that the water vapor begins to condense back into liquid water. But condensation is not a simple process. It requires a surface. Water molecules do not easily come together out of nothing and form a droplet, because a very small droplet has an extremely curved surface, and the physics of surface tension make it unstable and likely to evaporate again almost immediately. For a droplet to form and persist, it needs a nucleus, a tiny particle of something solid around which the water molecules can gather and cling. These particles are called cloud condensation nuclei, and they are everywhere in the atmosphere, though one never thinks about them. They are the fine dust lifted from dry fields and deserts, the salt crystals left behind when sea spray evaporates, the pollen grains from flowers and trees, the spores of fungi, and in the air over a 19th century city, they are also the smoke particles from 1,000 coal fires. The carbon specks from the chimneys were perfect for this purpose. They were small enough to float indefinitely, but large enough to provide a surface with many nooks and irregularities where the first few water molecules could adhere without the fatal curvature of a pure water droplet. As the air over the harbor cooled and the relative humidity approached 100%, water vapor molecules began to find these specks. A molecule of H2O, moving at several hundred meters per second in the random thermal motion of the gas, would happen to collide with a carbon particle, and instead of bouncing off it, would stick, held there by the weak electrostatic forces between the polar water molecule and the surface of the particle. Then another molecule would stick, and another, and another. At first, this accumulation was on a scale far too small to see, just a few hundred or a few thousand molecules clustered around a single speck. But as more molecules joined the cluster, it grew into something that began to behave like a very tiny droplet of liquid water. And once it reached a certain critical size, the curvature of its surface was no longer so extreme, and it became stable, capable of growing larger and larger as more vapor condensed onto it. All over the air above the harbor, this was happening. Millions upon millions of these tiny droplets were forming around the smoke particles and the salt crystals and the other invisible motes of dust. Each droplet was perhaps 1/100th of a millimeter across, far too small to be seen individually. But collectively, they began to change the appearance of the air. Where before the sky had been a pale, hazy grey, it was now taking on a deeper and more uniform grey, a color that had more substance to it, as if the air itself were thickening. The droplets scattered the remaining light from the setting sun and gave the whole sky a flat, even quality, the kind of sky that painters find difficult because there are no highlights and no shadows, only a smooth, continuous tone from horizon to horizon. This was the formation of a cloud, though it was not the kind of puffy white cloud that drifts across a summer sky. It was a stratus cloud, a layer cloud, a sheet of grey that hung over the city like a blanket being slowly lowered over a sleeping person. It had no distinct edges and no particular shape, just a gradual thickening of the air into something that could be called overcast. Among all the countless droplets forming in this layer, there was one that would become the subject of this long, slow journey. It is difficult to say exactly why this particular droplet was chosen, or why it merits any more attention than the trillions of others that formed and evaporated and reformed in the same air mass. There was nothing special about it. It formed around a carbon particle that had come from the chimney of a modest house on a modest street a few blocks back from the waterfront, a house where a family of 4 burned about 2 tons of coal each winter to keep their rooms from freezing. The particle was roughly spherical, but with a pitted and irregular surface, the kind of surface that forms when soft coal is burned incompletely and the volatile gases escape, leaving behind a porous carbon skeleton. The first water molecule to stick to it had probably come from the breath of a horse that had exhaled in a stable yard 3 miles away the previous morning, though it was impossible to trace such things with any certainty. The water had cycled through the air and the ground and the bodies of living things so many times over the eons that every molecule had a history too long and too complicated to recount. What mattered was that on this evening, in this air mass, at this particular temperature and humidity, the molecules came together and the droplet grew. It grew slowly. The process of condensation in a cooling air mass is not a sudden event but a gradual accumulation, like dust settling on a shelf or snow piling up on a windowsill. The droplet added molecules one at a time over the course of minutes and hours. It was in constant motion, not falling yet because it was too small and too light for gravity to overcome the random buffeting of the air molecules around it. It drifted with the slow currents in the cloud layer, currents that moved at a pace too slow for any human to perceive. A few centimeters per second perhaps, shifting this way and that as slightly warmer patches of air rose and slightly cooler patches sank. The droplet moved with these currents without any will or direction of its own, simply carried along by the collective motion of the air and the trillions of other droplets around it. As it grew, its weight increased, though weight is perhaps the wrong word for something so small. Its mass increased, and with increased mass came a slightly greater susceptibility to the pull of gravity. At the same time, its size increased, and with increased size came greater air resistance when it tried to move downward. These two forces, gravity pulling down and air resistance pushing up, balanced each other in a way that determined how fast the droplet would fall when it eventually began its descent. For a droplet of this size, perhaps 20 or 30 microns across, the terminal velocity was very small, on the order of a centimeter per second, or even less. It would take a very long time to fall from the cloud layer to the ground, and that was assuming it ever did fall. For now it was still suspended, still growing, still waiting. The conditions in the cloud layer continued to change as the evening deepened. The temperature dropped another fraction of a degree, and the relative humidity rose correspondingly. More vapor condensed onto the existing droplets, and they all grew slightly larger and slightly heavier. The air around them became slightly drier as the vapor was used up, but the cooling continued to lower the saturation point, and so the condensation continued. It was a slow feedback loop, cooling driving condensation, and condensation releasing a tiny amount of latent heat that slightly slowed the cooling, a push and pull that played out over the entire volume of the cloud. The droplets grew from 20 microns to 30, from 30 to 40, their masses increasing with the cube of their diameters. A droplet of 40 microns is still invisible to the naked eye, still just one of countless billions, but it is beginning to feel the pull of the earth a little more insistently. It is beginning to think about falling. If a droplet of water can be said to think about anything, the cloud layer had formed at an altitude of perhaps 800 meters above the harbor, which is not very high as clouds go, but high enough that the temperature there was noticeably cooler than at ground level. The lapse rate, the rate at which temperature decreases with altitude, was about 6 or 7 degrees Celsius per 1,000 meters on this particular evening, a typical value for the moist air that had come in from the sea. At ground level, the temperature was perhaps 12 degrees, cool enough for a coat, but not cold enough for frost. At 800 meters, it was closer to 7 degrees, and the dew point was just a fraction below that. The difference between the actual temperature and the dew point, called the dew point depression, had narrowed to less than half a degree and was still narrowing. The air was very nearly saturated, and the droplets were very nearly ready to fall. There was no precise moment when the droplet decided to begin its descent. There was no decision at all. What happened was simply that the droplet grew to a size where the upward motions of the air around it were no longer sufficient to keep it aloft. In the cloud layer, there are always small vertical currents, some up and some down, caused by differences in temperature and density that are too small to feel, but large enough to influence the motion of tiny droplets. A droplet that was 20 microns across might be carried upward by a rising current of a few millimeters per second, bouncing around in the turbulent eddies of the cloud without ever making any net progress downward. But as the droplet grew, its terminal velocity increased, and at some point it exceeded the speed of the upward currents around it. When that happened, the droplet began to sink relative to the air, still being pushed and jostled sideways, but now with a definite downward component to its motion. It had become a falling droplet, a raindrop in the earliest stage of its journey, though it was still far too small to be called rain in any conventional sense. It would grow much more before it reached the ground, collecting other droplets as it fell and merging with them, a process called coalescence that would increase its size 100-fold or more by the time it arrived at the rooftops below. The descent began gently. The droplet sank through the cloud layer, moving past other droplets that were still suspended, sometimes bumping into them and merging if the collision was gentle enough. Each merger added the mass of another droplet to its own, and each addition made it slightly heavier and slightly faster. The cloud was thickest near its base, and the droplet spent a long time moving through this region, collecting mass and growing from 40 microns to 60, from 60 to 80, its speed gradually increasing from a centimeter per second to 2 centimeters per second, still so slow that a falling leaf would have seemed like a racing horse by comparison. The world outside the cloud was invisible from within, just a uniform grey brightness in all directions with no hint of the city below or the sky above. The droplet had no sense of these things anyway. It moved according to the simple physics of its situation, gravity pulling it down, air resistance pushing it up, the random collisions with other droplets and air molecules nudging it this way and that. It was a small piece of a large and slow system, a system that had been operating for billions of years and would continue operating long after the city below had crumbled to dust and been forgotten. The base of the cloud was not a sharp boundary, but a gradual thinning out, a region where the density of droplets decreased until there were only scattered ones falling through clearer air below. The droplet crossed this transition without noticing, of course, and found itself in the open space between the cloud and the city. Below it, the rooftops of the Harbour district spread out in a dark, irregular pattern, punctuated by the occasional glow of a gas lamp or the warm orange square of a window where someone was still awake. The droplet could not see this. It had no eyes and no consciousness and no awareness of the scene below. It was simply a small sphere of water, slightly flattened on its underside by the pressure of the air it was falling through, containing a speck of carbon at its center and a thin film of whatever dissolved gases and particles it had picked up in the cloud. It was falling through the cool evening air at a speed that was now perhaps 10 centimeters per second, a speed that would carry it to the rooftops in a little over an hour if nothing intervened. And in that hour it would pass through the different layers of the city's air, each with its own temperature and its own scent and its own history, and it would continue to grow, and it would continue to fall, and it would arrive on a slate roof on the west side of a modest row house without any fanfare or notice, just another drop of water in a city that saw a million such drops every time it rained. That arrival, that first contact with the solid surface of the city, would be the beginning of the next part of the journey. But for now there was only the falling and the waiting, and the quiet, slow accumulation of mass in the darkening air above the harbour. The falling droplet had left the base of the cloud and now moved through a region of air that was different in several small and unremarkable ways. The cloud had been a crowded place, thick with other droplets, and filled with the diffuse grey light that comes from scattering in all directions. The air below the cloud was clearer and darker, though not entirely dark, because the city below cast up a faint glow from its gas lamps and its windows, and the last remnants of daylight still lingered along the western horizon like a thin smear of orange paint on a grey canvas. The droplet fell through this clearer air at a speed that had increased slightly as it gained mass from the smaller droplets it had encountered and absorbed during its passage through the lower reaches of the cloud. Its diameter was now perhaps 1/10 of a millimeter, which is roughly the thickness of a human hair, and its mass was something on the order of a few millionths of a gram. It was still far too small to be seen by anyone looking up from the street, and even if someone had been looking with a powerful magnifying glass, they would have seen only a faint glint among countless other faint glints, indistinguishable from the rest of the falling drizzle. The air through which the droplet fell was not uniform. It had layers, like a poorly mixed drink, though the boundaries between these layers were soft and gradual rather than sharp. The lowest few hundred meters of the atmosphere is called the surface layer, and it is the part of the air that feels the presence of the ground most directly. The ground heats the air during the day and cools it at night, and the friction of the wind against the buildings and trees and hills slows the air down and creates small eddies and swirls that mix the lower atmosphere in a slow and chaotic way. Above the surface layer is a transition zone, and then the mixed layer, which on this particular evening extended up to the base of the cloud. The droplet was falling through the upper part of the mixed layer, where the influence of the ground was still present but somewhat muted, like the sound of a distant streetcar heard through several walls. The temperature of the air changed as the droplet fell. At the cloud base, the temperature had been about 7 degrees Celsius, cool enough that a person standing there would have wanted a wool coat and perhaps a scarf. As the droplet descended, the temperature increased very gradually, following the same lapse rate that had governed the cloud formation but now in reverse. The air near the ground was warmer than the air aloft because the ground had stored some of the sun's heat from the afternoon and was slowly releasing it back into the atmosphere. This is why valleys are often cooler than hilltops on clear nights, because the cold air drains down into the low places and pools there. But on this evening, the air was not clear and the cooling was gentle, and the temperature difference between the cloud base and the rooftops was only a few degrees. The droplet did not feel this temperature change in any meaningful way, but the slight warming of the air around it did have one effect that was worth noting. It slightly reduced the relative humidity of the air, which meant that the droplet was now falling through an environment where evaporation was possible. A droplet that falls through unsaturated air will lose some of its water to the air, shrinking as it goes, unless it is falling fast enough and is large enough that the cooling effect of evaporation is balanced by the warming effect of the surrounding air. This droplet was small and slow, and the air was not very dry, so the evaporation was minimal. A slow loss of a few molecules from its surface that was more than compensated for by the occasional collision with another smaller droplet still lingering in the subcloud air. The droplet continued to fall, and as it fell it passed through the slight wind currents that moved through the lower atmosphere. There was no strong wind on this evening, no storm or gale or even a stiff breeze. The air was moving only a little, shifting this way and that in response to the uneven heating of the city below and the slow rotation of the larger weather system that had brought the marine air to the coast in the first place. At the altitude where the droplet was falling, perhaps 600 meters above the ground, the wind was from the west at about 2 meters per second, a gentle drift that would have been barely perceptible to a person standing still. This drift pushed the droplet sideways as it fell, adding a horizontal component to its motion that was about as large as its vertical component. The droplet was not falling straight down, but at a shallow angle, moving eastward at roughly the same speed it was moving downward, tracing a diagonal path through the darkening air. The city below was a patchwork of different surfaces and different temperatures, and these differences created small updrafts and downdrafts that the droplet encountered as it fell. A rooftop that had absorbed the afternoon sun would be radiating warmth upward, creating a gentle rising current of air above it. A courtyard shaded by tall buildings would be cooler and might have a slight sinking current. A street where a coal cart had recently passed would have a faint thermal from the horse's body heat. The droplet passed through these currents without any change to its own nature, simply being nudged a few centimeters to the left or right, slowed slightly or sped slightly, its path a gentle wobble around the straight line that gravity preferred. The net effect of all these nudges was that the droplet's landing spot on the ground would be some distance away from the point directly below where it had left the cloud, but that distance was impossible to predict and not particularly important. It would land somewhere in the city, on some surface, and that surface would be the beginning of the next stage of its journey. The sense of the city began to reach the falling droplet, though the droplet had no nose and no capacity for smell. What is meant by this is that the air through which the droplet fell contained molecules other than nitrogen and oxygen and water vapor, molecules that a human nose would have interpreted as smells. These molecules came from the activities of the city below, and they were mixed into the lower atmosphere by the same slow currents that nudged the droplet. There was the smell of coal smoke, of course, the same soft coal smoke that had provided the nucleus for the droplet's formation. This smell was everywhere in the city, a constant background that the residents no longer noticed, but that a visitor from the countryside would have remarked upon immediately. It was a heavy smell, slightly oily, with notes of sulfur and ash and the faint sweetness of incompletely burned hydrocarbons. The droplet passed through air that contained thousands of these smoke particles, some of them soot that had fallen and been stirred up again, some of them fresh from chimneys that were still burning for the evening meals and the heating of the parlours where families sat reading or sewing or simply staring into the coals. There was also the smell of the harbour itself, a complex mixture of salt water and fish, and the tarred ropes of the ships and the damp wood of the piers. The harbour smell was strongest near the water and faded as one moved inland, but on this evening the gentle west wind was pushing the marine air over the city and carrying the harbour smell with it, so that even the streets several blocks from the docks had a faint tang of the sea. The droplet had formed from that marine air and was now falling back toward it, completing a small loop in the larger cycle that moved water from the ocean to the sky to the land and back again. The salt that had helped some of the other droplets form was still present in the air, tiny crystals of sodium chloride that had been lofted from the surface of the bay when waves broke against the sea wall or when a ship's bow cut through the water. These salt particles were too small to see, but they were there, and some of them would eventually become the nuclei for other droplets in other clouds on other evenings. And there were the smells of the streets themselves. The smell of horse manure, which was ubiquitous in any 19th century city, and which the residents had long since ceased to regard as unpleasant. It was simply the smell of transportation, as normal and unremarkable as the smell of gasoline would become in a later century. The manure lay in the streets until the street sweepers came through with their brooms and carts, and in the meantime it dried and was ground to dust by the wheels of carriages and carts, and that dust rose into the air and travelled with the wind. The droplet fell through air that contained fine particles of this dust, organic matter that had passed through the digestive system of a horse and was now suspended in the atmosphere, waiting to be washed down by the rain and returned to the soil. There was the smell of baking bread from the bakeries that worked through the night to have fresh loaves ready for the morning. There was the smell of hops and malt from the breweries, a sweet and slightly sour smell that hung over certain neighbourhoods. There was the smell of the gas works, where coal was heated to produce the gas that lit the street lamps, a process that released a sulphurous odour that mixed with the other smells into a general urban atmosphere that was as characteristic of the time and place as the architecture of the buildings themselves. All of these smells were carried by molecules that drifted upward from their sources and mixed into the air, and the droplet passed through this mixture without interacting with most of it. The water in the droplet was a good solvent, and it would have absorbed some of these molecules if it had been in contact with them for long enough, but the droplet was falling through the air relatively quickly, and the contact time was brief. A few molecules of the various urban gases might have dissolved into the droplet's surface, but not enough to change its composition in any significant way. It was still almost entirely pure water, with its original carbon nucleus and a few other particles it had collected in the cloud, and it would remain mostly pure until it touched the surfaces of the city and began to pick up the dirt and grime that coated everything in a place where coal was burned by the ton every day. The droplet fell through a layer of air that was slightly warmer than the air above it, a layer that had been heated by the collective warmth of the city itself. Cities are always warmer than the countryside around them, a phenomenon that would later be called the urban heat island effect, but which was already well known to anyone who had walked from a rural lane into a paved street on a cold night. The bricks and stones and slates of the buildings absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, and the thousands of fires burning in the thousands of grates and stoves added their own warmth to the air. The result was that the air over the city was a degree or two warmer than the air over the surrounding fields and woods, and this warmth created a gentle upward motion of air over the city centre. The droplet was falling into this rising air, and its descent was slowed slightly by it, like a person walking down an up escalator. The slowing was not dramatic, but it added a few seconds to the journey, a few more moments of falling through the darkening sky. The light was fading as the droplet fell. The sun had set behind the low hills to the west, and the sky had gone from pale grey to a deeper grey, and then to a grey that was almost black, though the clouds themselves still held some of the city's glow and reflected it back down. The street lamps were being lit by the lamplighters making their evening rounds, each lamp adding a small pool of warm orange light to the street below. From the droplet's perspective, if it had had a perspective, these lights would have appeared as a scattering of faint glows far below, like distant campfires seen from a mountainside. But the droplet had no eyes and no awareness, and the lights meant nothing to it. It was simply a small sphere of water falling through the air, responding to gravity and air resistance and the gentle nudges of the wind, and it would continue to fall until it encountered a surface solid enough to stop it. The droplet passed the 500-meter mark and then the 400-meter mark, descending through air that was growing slightly warmer and slightly more filled with the smells and particles of the city. At 300 meters, it was low enough that the shapes of the larger buildings were becoming distinct from the general darkness of the ground, though a human observer would still have had difficulty making out details. The droplet fell past the spire of a church, a tall stone structure that pointed upward toward the sky from which the droplet had come. The spire was wet from the drizzle that had been falling intermittently for the past hour, and the stone was dark with moisture, but the droplet did not strike the spire. It passed to the east of it, carried by the slight westward drift of the wind, and continued its descent toward the rooftops of the residential streets that lay behind the waterfront. At 200 meters, the droplet entered the layer of air that was most directly affected by the individual buildings. The wind at this height was channeled by the streets and altered by the shapes of the rooftops, creating small eddies in sheltered pockets where the air moved more slowly or not at all. The droplet's path became slightly more irregular as it passed through these disturbances, but the overall direction was still downward and eastward. The air was noticeably warmer now, carrying the heat of the chimneys and the stored warmth of the sun-heated bricks, and the droplet's rate of evaporation increased slightly. It lost a few more molecules from its surface, a slow and steady loss that was still being offset by the occasional capture of a smaller droplet from the lingering drizzle. The net change in the droplet's size was small and not worth calculating precisely. At 100 meters, the droplet was close enough to the ground that a person looking up with sharp eyes might have seen it if the light had been better, but the evening was dark and the drizzle was too fine to be visible against the grey sky. The droplet fell past the upper windows of a row house, where a family was sitting down to a late supper, the light from their oil lamp spilling out into the darkness and illuminating the falling droplets for a brief moment before they passed out of the light and disappeared again. The droplet was not one of the ones that passed through that particular beam of light, but many others did, and anyone looking out the window would have seen a faint shimmer of falling moisture, a quiet confirmation that the rain was still coming down. The droplet approached the rooftops. The city below was a patchwork of slate and tile and wood and zinc, a complex topography of angles and planes that had been designed over the course of decades to shed water efficiently into the gutters and downspouts that lined the streets. The droplet was heading for one of these rooftops, the west-facing slope of a modest row house on a street that ran parallel to the harbour, a street that was quiet at this hour except for the occasional sound of a closing door or the distant clatter of a cart on cobblestones. The droplet did not know this and could not have chosen a different destination if it had known. It was simply following the path that gravity and the wind had laid out for it, a path that would end in a few more seconds when the droplet's downward motion was arrested by the hard surface of a slate tile. The final few meters of the fall were uneventful. The droplet passed through air that smelled strongly of coal smoke and wet stone and the faint sourness of a trash heap in a nearby alley. It fell past the edge of the roof, and then it was over the slope itself, a dark grey plain that was already wet from the droplets that had arrived before it. The droplet did not slow down or change course. It simply continued falling until the distance between its lower surface and the slate tile was 0, and then it struck. The impact was gentle by any reasonable standard. A droplet of this size falling at this speed does not splash or make a sound that a human ear could detect. It simply touches the surface and flattens slightly, its spherical shape deforming into a flattened dome as the water molecules at the leading edge encounter the solid surface and stop moving downward, while the molecules behind them continue to move for a moment longer. The droplet merged with the thin film of water that already covered the slate, a film that was only a fraction of a millimeter thick, but that was enough to cushion the arrival and allow the droplet to join the collective flow without any disturbance. The individual droplet ceased to exist as a separate entity at that moment. Its water became part of the sheet of water that was slowly moving down the slope of the roof, pulled by gravity toward the gutter at the lower edge. The carbon particle that had been its nucleus was now just one of many particles suspended in the water, a tiny speck of soot that had travelled from a chimney to the cloud and back down again, completing a small loop in the endless circulation of the city's air and water. the droplet's journey through the air was over. Its journey across the surfaces of the city was about to begin, a journey that would take it down the slope of the slate, into the copper gutter, through the cast iron downspout, and eventually into the dark channels below the street. But that was for the chapters to come. For now there was only the quiet arrival on the wet roof, the merging with the film of water already there, and the slow beginning of the slide toward the edge. The night was dark and the rain was gentle, and the city was settling into the quiet rhythms of the evening, and the droplet was no longer a droplet, but a part of something larger, a small contribution to the flow that would carry the dust of the streets down to the harbor and out to the sea. The roof upon which the droplet had landed was made of slate, a material that had been formed several 100 million years before the city existed, and had been quarried from a hillside in Wales some 50 years prior to this particular rainy evening. Slate is a metamorphic rock, which means it began as something else, in this case a fine-grained sedimentary mudstone that had been laid down on the floor of an ancient sea when the land that would become Wales was somewhere near the equator and covered by warm, shallow water. Over the course of unimaginable spans of time, that mudstone was buried under later layers of sediment and subjected to heat and pressure deep within the earth. And under those conditions, the clay minerals in the mudstone recrystallize and align themselves into thin, parallel sheets, a process that geologists call foliation, and that gives slate its most useful property, which is that it can be split into thin, flat plates with very little effort. The quarrymen in Wales knew exactly how to do this, driving wedges into the natural cleavage planes of the rock and separating it into sheets of uniform thickness, and these sheets were then trimmed to size and shipped to ports all over the world, including the port of this particular city, where they were loaded onto carts and delivered to the houses being built for the expanding middle class of merchants and clerks and skilled tradesmen. The row house that received the droplet was one of a block of 12 identical houses built in the year 1863, according to the date stone set into the corner of the facade. The builder had purchased a shipment of Welsh slate from a yard near the docks and had instructed his roofers to lay it in the standard pattern, each slate overlapping the ones below it by about 3 inches so that water running down the roof would flow from one slate to the next without ever finding a seam that led directly to the wooden sheathing underneath. The slates were held in place by copper nails driven through pre-drilled holes near their top edges, 2 nails per slate, and the nail heads were covered by the overlapping slates above so that they were protected from the weather. Copper was chosen because it does not rust like iron, and because it weathers to a dark brown patina that blends with the grey of the slate, and also because copper nails are soft enough to bend slightly with the expansion and contraction of the roof without cracking the brittle stone. The particular slate that received the droplet was located about 2/3 of the way up the west-facing slope of the roof, which meant it was in the upper portion of the roof's surface, but not at the very peak. The west-facing slope caught the afternoon sun and the prevailing wind that came off the harbour, and as a result it had weathered slightly differently than the east-facing slope on the other side of the ridge. The slates on the west side had been subjected to more cycles of wetting and drying, and more exposure to the ultraviolet light of the sun, which over the decades had caused a very subtle change in their surface colour, from the original dark blue-grey to something slightly lighter and slightly warmer in tone, a grey that had a hint of brown in it if one looked closely in the right light. The surface had also developed a fine network of tiny cracks and pits that were invisible from the street, but that could be felt as a slight roughness if one were to run a finger over the stone, which no one had done since the roofers had finished their work and climbed down for the last time. In addition to the natural weathering of the slate itself, there was an accumulation of material that had settled onto the roof from the air over the years. The city was a place where things burned constantly. Coal in the grates and stoves and furnaces, wood in the fireplaces of the poorer neighborhoods, gas in the street lamps and the newer houses, and occasionally other things like rubbish heaps or the accidental fires that broke out in stables and warehouses. All of this burning produced smoke, and the smoke carried fine particles of ash and soot, and partially burned carbon up into the air, where they drifted on the wind until they settled onto whatever surface was available. The roofs of the city received a share of this fallout proportional to their surface area and their orientation to the wind, and the west-facing slope of this particular row house received more than its share because it faced into the prevailing breeze that carried the smoke from the industrial districts near the harbour. The result was a thin film of dark material that coated every slate on the roof, not thick enough to obscure the grey colour of the stone, but enough to darken it slightly and to give it a faintly greasy feel if touched, which it rarely was. This film was composed mostly of carbon, with traces of sulfur compounds and heavy metals that had been present in the coal, and it had accumulated over years and decades until it reached a kind of equilibrium where new soot arrived at about the same rate that old soot was washed away by the rain. The droplet that had just arrived on the roof did not encounter the bare slate surface directly. It landed on a thin layer of water that already covered the slate, a layer that had been deposited by the droplets that had fallen in the minutes and hours before this one. The rain had been falling for some time now, a steady light drizzle that was not heavy enough to be called a shower, but was persistent enough to wet every exposed surface in the city. On the sloping plane of the roof, this water did not remain in place as individual droplets, but spread out into a continuous film that covered the entire surface of each slate and bridged the narrow gaps between adjacent slates. The film was very thin, perhaps 1/10 of a millimeter or less on average, but it was everywhere, and it was slowly moving downward under the pull of gravity. The physics of a thin water film on a sloping surface is a subject that has been studied by scientists and engineers for a very long time, because it matters for things like the design of gutters and the prevention of leaks and the calculation of how much water a roof can shed in a given storm. The water molecules at the interface with the slate are held in place by adhesive forces, the weak electrical attractions between the polar water molecules and the ions and charged sites on the surface of the slate. The water molecules above the interface are held to the lower molecules by cohesive forces, the same hydrogen bonding that gives water its high surface tension and its other unusual properties. The result of these forces is that the water film as a whole resists flowing down the slope until the pull of gravity overcomes the resistance, and the thickness of the film and the speed of its flow depend on the balance between gravity and viscosity. For a gentle slope like this roof, which was pitched at an angle of perhaps 30 degrees from the horizontal, and for a thin film like this one, the flow was very slow, a creeping movement that would take many minutes to carry a given water molecule from the peak of the roof to the gutter at the eaves. The droplet that had just arrived merged with this film almost instantly. The moment its leading surface touched the existing water, there was no longer a boundary between the droplet and the film, because water does not maintain a boundary with itself. The molecules of the droplet simply joined the collective and began to move with it, subject to the same forces and the same slow drift down the slope. The carbon particle that had been the droplet's nucleus was now suspended in the film, along with all the other particles that had arrived in other droplets, or had been washed off the slate surface by the rain. These particles were too small to settle out of the water under their own weight, because the random thermal motion of the water molecules kept them bouncing around in a process called Brownian motion, which is named after the botanist Robert Brown, who observed pollen grains jiggling under his microscope and correctly deduced that they were being pushed around by the invisible motion of the water molecules. The soot particle and the other suspended solids would remain in the water until something caused them to be deposited somewhere, perhaps in the gutter or on the street or eventually in the harbour, but for now they were simply carried along with the flow. The water film on the slate had a texture that was not uniform across the entire surface. The slate itself was not perfectly smooth, but had a slight grain to it, a result of the alignment of the mica and chlorite minerals that made up the rock. This grain was oriented roughly in the direction of the roof slope, because the roofers had laid the slates with their natural cleavage parallel to the slope for ease of splitting and nailing. The water film followed this grain in a very subtle way, with the flow being slightly faster in the tiny grooves and slightly slower over the tiny ridges, a variation that was too small to see but that mattered on the scale of the individual water molecules. There were also the scratches left by the tools of the roofers, faint lines in the surface where a nail had slipped or a hammer had glanced off the slate, and there were the edges of the slate itself where it overlapped the slate below. A step of about 1/4 of an inch, where the water film had to flow over a small lip before continuing down the next slate. All of these small features influenced the path of the water in ways that were too complex to predict in detail, but that collectively produced a slow and meandering downward movement. The sound of the rain on the roof was a quiet hiss, a sound so constant and so soft that the residents of the house had long since ceased to hear it unless they made a deliberate effort. It was the sound of a million tiny impacts spread over the entire surface of the roof, each droplet striking with a force too small to measure individually, but collectively creating a steady background noise that was almost indistinguishable from silence. Inside the house, the sound was further muffled by the layer of plaster and lath that formed the ceiling of the upper rooms, and by the small attic space that lay between the ceiling and the underside of the roof. In the attic, the sound was clearer, a soft patter on the slate just inches above the wooden rafters, and if anyone had been in the attic at that hour, they would have heard it as a gentle and soothing reminder of the weather outside. But no one was in the attic. The family was downstairs, finishing their supper and preparing for bed, and the attic was dark and still and filled with the accumulated objects of a household's life. A trunk of old clothes, a broken chair waiting to be repaired, a stack of newspapers tied with twine, a child's outgrown toys, all of them gathering a fine layer of the same dust that coated the roof outside, but which had found its way through the small gaps and cracks in the building's structure. The water film continued its slow journey down the slope of the slate. At the lower edge of this particular slate, the water encountered the overlap with the slate below, the point where the upper slate covered the top few inches of the lower slate. This overlap was designed to prevent water from penetrating the roof by ensuring that any water running down the upper slate would fall onto the exposed face of the lower slate and continue its journey rather than finding a seam and seeping underneath. The design worked because water has a property called surface tension that makes it tend to cling to a surface rather than detaching and falling freely, at least when it is moving slowly. The water film flowed over the lip of the upper slate and immediately adhered to the surface of the lower slate, continuing its downward path without any interruption or splash. A small amount of water might have wicked upward under the overlap by capillary action, but the slope of the roof and the weight of the water behind it ensured that the net movement was always downward, away from the ridge and toward the eaves. The journey from the peak of the roof to the gutter at the bottom was a distance of perhaps 15 feet, and for a given water molecule in the film it might take half an hour or more to cover that distance, depending on the exact path it followed and the thickness of the film and the temperature of the water, which affected its viscosity. The droplet that had just arrived, now dispersed into the general flow, would be part of this slow migration. Some of its molecules might reach the gutter relatively quickly if they happened to be near the surface of the film and were carried by the slightly faster current there, while others might linger near the slate interface and take much longer, held back by the adhesive forces that bound them to the stone. There was no way to know and no reason to care. The water moved as water moves, governed by forces that had been understood for centuries and that operated with perfect reliability and perfect indifference. The night deepened around the row house. The street below was empty now, except for a single lamplighter making his final round. His long pole, with its small flame reaching up to each lamp in turn to extinguish the gas for the night, a ritual that would be reversed in the morning when the lamps were lit again. The lamplighter moved slowly down the street, his footsteps echoing softly on the wet cobblestones, and he did not look up at the roofs or notice the thin film of water sliding down the slates above him. He was thinking about his supper and his bed and the ache in his shoulders from a long day of walking and reaching, and the rain was just a part of the background of his life, something to be endured and then forgotten. He reached the end of the street, turned the corner, and disappeared into the darkness, leaving the street empty and silent except for the sound of the rain. Inside the row house, the family was settling into the quiet routines of the late evening. The fire in the parlor grate had burned down to a bed of glowing coals and a single small flame that flickered blue and orange over the remaining lumps of coal. The father sat in his armchair reading a newspaper that was 2 days old. The news already stale, but still of interest because there was no other source of information about the wider world, except for the conversations at his place of work and the occasional letter from a relative. The mother was in the kitchen washing the supper dishes in a basin of water that had been heated on the stove, water that had been pumped from the cistern in the basement that very morning and that had begun its own journey somewhere far away, perhaps in the same reservoir that supplied the rest of the neighborhood. The children were in their beds upstairs, listening to the sound of the rain on the roof and drifting slowly towards sleep, their minds filled with the vague and pleasant images that come just before unconsciousness. The water film on the roof continued to flow. It was joined by new droplets arriving from the cloud above, a steady supply of fresh water that kept the film from thinning out as it moved down the slope. The rate of arrival was roughly constant, the light drizzle that had been falling for hours and that showed no sign of stopping or intensifying. This was a rain that the weather observers at the meteorological office would have described as steady and light, with a rate of perhaps 2 millimeters per hour. Enough to wet the ground thoroughly, but not enough to cause the street gutters to overflow or the basements to flood. It was a gentle and unremarkable rain, the kind of rain that is common in maritime climates and that the residents of the city accepted as a normal part of life, neither celebrated like a summer shower nor feared like a winter storm. The water film approached the lower edge of the slate and prepared to make the transition to the next slate in the sequence, a transition that it had made hundreds of times already and would make hundreds of times more before it reached the gutter. Each transition was a small event on the scale of the water molecules, a moment when the adhesive forces shifted from the surface of one slate to the surface of the next. But on the scale of the roof as a whole, it was just a continuation of the same slow and steady process. The water moved down, always down, pulled by a force that had been pulling water down slopes for as long as there had been water and slopes on the surface of the earth. There was no hurry, and no destination beyond the immediate one, just the quiet and patient work of gravity on a thin film of water on a slate roof in a sleeping city. The lower edge of the lowest slate on the west-facing slope was not a sharp boundary between the roof and the open air, but rather a transition to a different kind of surface. A surface that had been designed and installed specifically to receive the water that flowed off the roof and to channel it toward a single point of discharge. This surface was the gutter, and on this particular row house the gutter was made of copper. Copper had been chosen for the same reasons that copper nails had been used to fasten the slates. It did not rust away like iron. It could be formed into long continuous sections without joints that might leak, and it weathered over time to a dark brown and then a soft green patina that was considered attractive by the standards of the day. The gutter had been installed when the house was built and had been in place for several decades, enduring every rain that had fallen on this street since the year 1863. The copper sheets that formed the gutter had originally been bright and shiny, the color of a new penny, but they had long since lost that luster. The surface of the copper had reacted with the oxygen in the air over the years to form a thin layer of copper oxide, which was dark brown and which protected the metal underneath from further corrosion. In the places where the gutter was most frequently wet, particularly along the bottom where water pooled and flowed, the oxide layer had reacted further with carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds in the city air to form copper carbonate and copper sulfate, compounds that were various shades of green ranging from a pale verdigris to a deep malachite. This green patina was uneven and streaked, darker in the crevices and lighter on the raised edges, and it gave the gutter the appearance of something that had grown rather than been made, a natural accretion on the built environment of the city. The gutter was attached to the fascia board at the edge of the roof by a series of copper brackets that were spaced approximately every 2 feet along its length. These brackets were simple L-shaped pieces of metal, one leg nailed to the wooden fascia and the other leg supporting the outer rim of the gutter, and they had been installed with a very slight downward slope toward the eastern end of the house where the downspout was located. The slope was not visible to the eye, but it was essential to the function of the gutter because water does not flow horizontally without some gradient to pull it along. The builder had calculated the proper slope, which was about 1 inch of drop for every 10 feet of run, and the roofers had adjusted the brackets accordingly, shimming them with small pieces of wood or bending them slightly until a marble placed in the gutter would roll slowly but steadily toward the downspout. Over the years, the wooden fascia had settled and warped slightly, and the copper brackets had bent under the weight of winter snows, so the slope was no longer perfectly uniform, but it was still sufficient to keep the water moving in the right general direction. The water film that had been sliding down the slates arrived at the lower edge of the roof and encountered a small gap, the space between the end of the slate and the inner wall of the gutter. This gap was perhaps half an inch wide, and it was bridged by the surface tension of the water, which allowed the film to stretch across the open space and make contact with the copper surface on the other side. The water did not fall as individual drops, but rather flowed continuously from the slate to the gutter, a thin sheet of liquid that curved downward under its own weight and adhered to the inner wall of the copper channel. This transition happened all along the length of the roof, a long curtain of water that was too thin to see from the street, but that was steadily transferring the accumulated moisture of the cloud into the drainage system of the house. Inside the gutter, the water collected into a shallow stream that was perhaps an inch wide and a quarter of an inch deep at the center, tapering to nothing at the edges where the water was held by surface tension against the copper walls. The stream moved slowly, much more slowly than one might expect given the slope of the roof above, because the slope of the gutter was so gentle that the pull of gravity was barely enough to overcome the friction of the water against the copper and the internal viscosity of the water itself. A leaf or a twig floating in the stream would have moved at a pace that was just barely perceptible, perhaps a few inches per second, and a small particle of silt might have taken several minutes to travel the length of the gutter from the western end of the house to the downspout at the eastern end. The gutter was not empty. It had been collecting debris for weeks and months and years. All the small things that fell from the sky or were blown onto the roof or grew in the damp environment of the channel. There was a fine layer of sediment on the bottom of the gutter, a dark sludge that was composed mostly of the same soot and ash that had accumulated on the slates, but which had been washed down by previous rains and concentrated in the slow-moving water of the gutter. This sediment was very fine, with particles too small to see individually, and it formed a soft and slippery coating that reduced the friction of the water slightly, but also provided a medium for other things to grow. Among the sediment there were larger items that had found their way into the gutter and had not yet been flushed out. There were several maple seeds of the kind that spin like helicopters when they fall from the trees, their papery wings now soaked and limp, and their seed bodies swollen with water. These seeds had come from a maple tree that grew in the small back garden of a house 2 streets away, a tree that had been planted by a previous owner who had wanted some shade in the summer and some color in the autumn, and the seeds had been carried on the wind until they landed on this roof and were washed into the gutter. There was a single frayed strand of hemp rope, perhaps 6 inches long, that had probably come from a delivery cart or a ship's rigging and had been blown onto the roof during a windy day. The rope was dark with moisture and coated with a thin film of the same sediment that lined the gutter, and it lay along the bottom of the channel like a small brown snake. There was a fragment of a clay pigeon, a curved piece of baked clay about the size of a thumbnail, left over from some shooting contest held on the outskirts of the city and carried into the air by a gust of wind. There were several small stones of the kind that become lodged in the soles of boots and are later dislodged on doorsteps or cobblestones, and these had been kicked or blown onto the roof by some unknown agency. There was also a thin growth of moss on the inner wall of the gutter, a soft green fuzz that had established itself in the damp and shaded environment where the water was most constant. The moss was a species of the genus Bryum, a common urban moss that could tolerate the copper ions that leached from the gutter and that could survive the periodic drying out that happened during dry spells. The moss did not cover the entire gutter, but grew in patches where the conditions were most favorable, and it provided a microscopic habitat for other small organisms, bacteria that broke down the organic matter in the sediment, single-celled algae that photosynthesized in the dim light that filtered through the overcast sky, and tiny invertebrates called rotifers and tardigrades that grazed on the bacteria and algae. None of this was visible from the street, or even from a close inspection, but it was there, a small ecosystem operating in the narrow channel of copper that ran along the edge of the roof. The water stream picked up some of the sediment as it flowed, lifting the finest particles into suspension and carrying them along toward the downspout. The slightly larger particles, the sand grains, and the fragments of soot that were just heavy enough to resist being lifted, rolled and bounced along the bottom of the gutter in a process that geologists call saltation, a series of small hops that moved the particles a fraction of an inch at a time. The maple seeds were too large and too light to be moved in this way, and they simply floated on the surface of the water, drifting with the current and occasionally catching on a rough spot in the copper or on a protruding nail head. The strand of rope lay where it had been for weeks, too heavy with water to float and too tangled with sediment to be pushed along, a permanent resident of the gutter, until some human hand reached up and removed it. The chemistry of the water changed slightly as it flowed through the copper gutter. Copper is not completely inert, and it does dissolve very slowly in water, especially water that is slightly acidic from the dissolved carbon dioxide that makes all rainwater a weak solution of carbonic acid. The copper ions that leached into the water were present in very small concentrations, a few parts per million at most, but they were enough to give the water a faint metallic taste if anyone had been inclined to taste it, and enough to inhibit the growth of certain kinds of bacteria and fungi. This is why copper has been used for water pipes and vessels for thousands of years, because it has a mild antimicrobial effect that keeps the water fresher than it would be in a container made of wood or clay. The water that flowed through the gutter was not intended for drinking, of course, but the copper was still doing its quiet work of suppressing the growth of slime and odor that might otherwise have developed in the stagnant pools that form during dry weather. The water stream moved past the various obstacles in the gutter with the patience of something that has no schedule to keep and no destination that must be reached by a particular time. When it encountered a maple seed, it divided around it, flowing to the left and right and rejoining on the downstream side, leaving a small wake of still water behind the seed. When it encountered a patch of moss, it flowed over and through the tiny leaves and stems, slowed slightly by the increased surface area and the drag of the fine filaments. When it encountered a small stone, it flowed around it, and if the stone was large enough, a tiny eddy formed in its lee, a small swirl of water that rotated slowly and trapped a few particles of sediment before they were eventually released and carried onward. All of these small interactions added to the time it took for a given volume of water to travel the length of the gutter, and the droplet that had arrived on the roof some time ago, now dispersed among the millions of other droplets that had arrived before and after, was subject to these delays along with all the rest. The sound of the water in the gutter was different from the sound of the rain on the roof. It was a lower and more continuous sound, a soft gurgle that came from the places where the water flowed around obstacles or dropped over small irregularities in the copper. This sound was too quiet to be heard from inside the house, and too faint to be noticed by anyone walking on the street below. But it was present nonetheless, a small part of the larger acoustic environment of the rainy night. If a person had been standing on a ladder with their ear close to the gutter, they would have heard it clearly, a gentle and soothing noise that might have reminded them of a small brook in a forest or a fountain in a quiet garden, but no one was standing on a ladder, and no one was listening. The gutter continued its run along the edge of the roof, passing over the party wall between this row house and the one next door. The party wall was a thick masonry structure that separated the two houses and supported the ends of the roof rafters, and the gutter ran continuously over it without any break or joint. The builder had taken care to ensure that the gutter was properly supported at this point and that the slope was maintained across the transition, because a low spot at the party wall would have caused water to pond and eventually overflow, staining the brickwork and perhaps causing dampness in the walls below. The water flowed smoothly over this section, carried by the slight but steady gradient that pulled it toward the eastern end of the block. At the far end of the row house, the gutter reached the corner of the building and made a 90-degree turn to follow the gable end toward the downspout. This turn was formed by a prefabricated copper corner piece that had been soldered to the straight sections of gutter on either side, and the solder joints were still sound after all these years, a testament to the skill of the tinsmith who had made them. The water flowed around this corner with a slight increase in speed as the channel narrowed slightly at the bend, and then it straightened out again for the final short run to the downspout opening. This opening was a rectangular hole cut into the bottom of the gutter and fitted with a copper collar that directed the water downward into the vertical pipe, and it was covered by a simple wire strainer that was intended to keep the largest debris from entering the downspout and causing a blockage. The wire strainer was clogged with a mat of wet leaves and maple seeds and the same grey sediment that lined the bottom of the gutter, but the water found its way through the gaps in the debris and poured into the opening, disappearing from the open air of the roof and entering the dark interior of the downspout. The transition from the gutter to the downspout was a significant one for the water, though the water itself had no awareness of the change. In the gutter, the water had been exposed to the air and the faint light of the overcast sky, and its movements had been a slow and meandering drift across a broad and shallow channel. In the downspout, the water would be confined within a narrow vertical pipe and would fall more quickly, pulled straight down by gravity with only the friction of the iron walls to slow it. The journey through the downspout would be a different kind of experience, a period of darkness and increased speed and a new set of sounds, and it would end in a different place entirely, at the level of the street where the water would emerge into the open air again and begin its passage through the channels and drains of the city. That journey would be the subject of the next part of this slow and patient story, but for now there was only the quiet flow of water along the copper gutter, the gentle accumulation of silt and debris, and the soft and steady sound of a rainy night in a sleeping city. The water that had been flowing slowly along the copper gutter now reached the opening that led to the downspout and passed through it without any hesitation or change in its essential nature. The opening was a rectangular hole cut into the bottom of the gutter and lined with a short copper collar that extended downward about 2 inches into the top of the downspout pipe. This collar was slightly smaller in diameter than the pipe itself, so that the water would fall freely into the pipe without touching the sides immediately, a small detail of design that prevented water from wicking back up between the collar and the pipe and dripping onto the wooden soffit below. The wire strainer that covered the opening was meant to catch leaves and twigs and other large debris, but it was old and bent, and the mesh had been pushed down in the center by the weight of wet leaves in previous seasons, leaving a gap around the edges where the water could flow through, even when the center was clogged. The water found these gaps easily and poured through them, a thin and steady stream that fell the short distance from the collar to the inside wall of the downspout, and then began its vertical descent. The downspout was made of cast iron, a material that had been chosen for its strength and its durability and its low cost compared to copper or lead. Iron was abundant and cheap and could be cast into almost any shape using molds made of sand, and the foundries that produced these pipes were busy all year round supplying the growing cities with the infrastructure they needed to manage water and waste and gas. The particular downspout on this row house had been cast in a foundry located about 3 miles away on the bank of a canal that connected the city to the coal fields and the iron mines of the interior. The iron ore had been smelted in a blast furnace fired with coke, made from the same coal that heated the houses of the city, and the molten iron had been poured into molds that produced pipe sections 6 feet long, with a bell-shaped socket at one end and a plain spigot at the other. These sections were joined together by inserting the spigot end of one pipe into the bell end of the pipe below and packing the joint with a mixture of oakum and molten lead, a method that had been used for centuries and that created a seal that was both watertight and flexible enough to accommodate the slight movements of the building over time. The downspout on this house was composed of 3 such sections of pipe, each 6 feet long, connected together to form a continuous vertical conduit that ran from the gutter at the roof edge down to a curved shoe at ground level where the water would be discharged onto the street. The total height of the downspout was therefore about 18 feet, the distance from the eaves of a 3-story row house to the cobblestones of the street below. The pipe was attached to the brick wall of the house by iron brackets that encircled the pipe and was screwed into wooden plugs set into the mortar joints, a method that was secure enough for the weight of the pipe, but that allowed for some movement and vibration when the wind blew or when the water rushed through. The interior of the cast iron pipe was not smooth. The casting process left a slightly rough surface with small bumps and ridges where the sand mold had not been perfectly uniform, and over the decades that the pipe had been in place this surface had changed in ways that were slow and cumulative and largely invisible from the outside. The water that flowed through the pipe during every rain carried dissolved oxygen and carbon dioxide and traces of other substances from the air and the roof, and these reacted with the iron to form rust, which is a mixture of iron oxides and hydroxides that occupies more volume than the original iron and that adheres loosely to the surface. The rust did not form a smooth coating, but rather a crusty and uneven layer with peaks and valleys and small caverns that were visible only on a microscopic scale. In addition to the rust, there was a build-up of mineral scale from the water itself, mostly calcium carbonate, that had precipitated out of solution as the water evaporated between rains, leaving behind a thin white film that darkened over time as it mixed with the rust and the soot that washed down from the roof. The result was an interior surface that was complex and irregular, a landscape of corrosion and deposition that influenced the flow of water in small but measurable ways. The sound inside the downspout was different from the sound outside. In the open air of the roof and the gutter, the sound of the rain had been a soft and diffuse hiss, a noise that came from all directions, and that blended with the other sounds of the city into a gentle background. Inside the downspout, The sound was contained and amplified by the iron walls, and it took on a hollow and resonant quality that was more like the sound of a distant waterfall heard through a long tunnel. The water falling through the pipe did not fill the entire cross-section, but rather flowed down the inner wall in a thin sheet, and the air in the center of the pipe was pushed and pulled by the falling water in ways that created a low and continuous gurgle. This gurgle was not loud enough to be heard from inside the house, except perhaps in the attic where the pipe passed through the eaves, but it was a constant presence in the narrow space of the pipe itself, a sound that had been playing on rainy nights for decades and that would continue to play as long as the rain fell and the pipe stood. The flow of water in a vertical pipe is governed by the same principles that govern the flow in any conduit, but the vertical orientation adds the full force of gravity to the equation and allows the water to accelerate in ways that are not possible on the gentle slopes of the roof and gutter. When the water first enters the top of the downspout, it is moving relatively slowly, having just completed its meandering journey along the gutter at a speed of a few inches per second. As it falls through the vertical pipe, it accelerates, pulled downward by gravity. But this acceleration is limited by the friction of the water against the pipe wall and by the internal viscosity of the water itself. After a certain distance, which for a pipe of this size and roughness is only a few feet, the water reaches a terminal velocity where the force of gravity is balanced by the forces of friction and viscosity, and it continues to fall at a constant speed for the remainder of the descent. This speed is faster than the flow in the gutter, but still slow enough that the journey from the roof to the street takes several seconds, enough time for a human observer to count slowly to 5 or 6 if they were able to follow a single parcel of water. The water did not fall as a solid column, but rather as a thin film clinging to the inner wall of the pipe, a configuration that engineers call annular flow. The center of the pipe was filled with air that moved downward along with the water, creating a slight suction that helped to pull the water film along and that prevented it from detaching from the wall and falling as individual drops. The thickness of the water film varied around the circumference of the pipe depending on the local roughness of the rust and scale, and there were places where the film was thicker and moved more slowly, and places where it was thinner and moved more slowly, and places where it was thinner and moved more quickly. These variations created small ripples and waves on the surface of the film, perturbations that traveled downward at slightly different speeds, and that occasionally merged or cancelled each other out in ways that were too complex to predict, but that added a subtle texture to the flow. The water carried with it the small particles that it had picked up on the roof and in the gutter, the fine soot and ash that gave the water a faint grey tint, the microscopic fragments of moss and algae, the dissolved copper ions that had leached from the gutter, and the various other substances that had accumulated in the slow-moving stream. Inside the downspout, these particles were subjected to the same forces as the water itself, but their larger size and different density meant that they did not always follow the flow exactly. The heaviest particles, the sand grains and the small fragments of slate that had been washed off the roof, tended to sink toward the bottom of the water film and moved slightly more slowly, scraping against the rust and scale and sometimes becoming lodged in the crevices where they would remain until a heavier flow of water dislodged them. The lightest particles, the fine soot and the organic matter, remained suspended in the water and traveled at roughly the same speed as the flow. The copper ions and other dissolved substances were carried along without any independent motion of their own, simply part of the water itself. The temperature inside the downspout was slightly different from the temperature of the outside air. The cast iron pipe was in contact with the brick wall of the house, and the brick wall was in contact with the interior plaster and the warm air of the rooms inside. Some of this warmth conducted through the brick and into the iron, and from the iron into the water film, raising the temperature of the water by a fraction of a degree. This slight warming was not enough to be felt by a human hand, but it was enough to affect the viscosity of the water very slightly, making it a tiny bit less viscous and allowing it to flow a tiny bit more freely. The warming also meant that the water was slightly less dense than it would have been otherwise, a fact that had no practical consequence, but that was true nonetheless. The descent through the downspout took the water past the upper floors of the row house, floors that were dark and quiet at this hour of the night. The top floor contained the attic and the small bedrooms where the children slept, their breathing slow and regular under the heavy quilts that kept out the chill of the rainy night. The water passed behind the plaster wall of the children's room, without any sound that could penetrate the lath and plaster and the accumulated layers of wallpaper and paint. If one of the children had been awake and listening very carefully, they might have heard a faint and distant rushing sound, but they were asleep and dreaming, and the sound was too soft to disturb even the lightest sleeper. The water continued its descent past the middle floor where the parents' bedroom was located, a room with a large iron bedstead and a washstand with a china basin and a small fireplace that was cold now because the family saved coal by only heating the parlor in the evenings. The mother and father slept soundly, accustomed to the sounds of the city and the house, and the water in the downspout was just one more sound among many that their sleeping minds filtered out and ignored. The water passed the main floor where the parlor and the kitchen were located, the rooms where the family had spent their waking hours before retiring to bed. The parlor was dark except for the faint glow of the dying coals in the grate, and the kitchen was dark entirely, the dishes from supper dried and put away, the stove cold and the kettle empty. The water flowed down through the pipe that was attached to the outside wall just beyond the kitchen window, and if anyone had been standing at that window looking out into the rainy street, they might have seen the dark shape of the downspout and heard the soft gurgle of the water inside. But no one was standing there, and no one was looking. At the bottom of the downspout, the pipe made a gentle curve outward from the wall, a curved section of cast iron called a shoe that directed the water away from the foundation of the house and onto the street or into a drain. This shoe was cast in a single piece with a socket at the top that received the bottom section of straight pipe and a flared opening at the bottom that spread the water out slightly as it emerged. The shoe had been installed at a slight angle so that the water would be directed toward the shallow channel that ran along the edge of the cobblestone street, and over the years the cobblestones beneath the shoe had been worn smooth by the constant dripping and flowing of water from countless rains. There was a small depression in the stones where the water had fallen for decades, a shallow basin that held a small pool of water even between rains, and the surface of the stones in this depression was darker and smoother than the surrounding cobblestones. The water film that had been clinging to the inner wall of the downspout reached the curve of the shoe and was forced to change direction, following the bend of the iron outward toward the opening. This change in direction caused the water to detach slightly from the wall and to gather into a more concentrated stream, a small rivulet that flowed along the bottom of the shoe and emerged from the opening as a thin and steady flow rather than as a film. The sound of the water changed again as it emerged, losing the hollow resonance of the pipe and taking on the brighter and more open sound of water falling a short distance onto stone. The gurgle of the downspout gave way to a soft splashing, a sound that was almost musical in its irregular rhythm, and the water spread out over the worn cobblestones and began its journey along the street. The transition from the downspout to the street marked the end of the vertical phase of the water's journey and the beginning of the horizontal phase. The water had fallen from the cloud to the roof and had flowed across the slate and through the copper gutter and down the iron pipe, a journey that had taken it from the sky to the earth in a series of slow and patient steps. Now it was at ground level, joining the other water that had emerged from other downspouts and from the direct fall of rain onto the streets, and it would begin to move through the channels and drains that carried the city's water away to the harbor and the sea. The night was still dark, and the rain was still falling, and the city was still sleeping, and the water continued its quiet and unremarkable journey without any hurry or any destination beyond the next gentle slope and the next open channel. The water emerged from the curved iron shoe at the base of the downspout and fell a short distance to the cobblestones below, a distance of perhaps 8 or 10 inches from the lip of the shoe to the worn surface of the street. The fall was not a dramatic plunge, but a gentle and continuous pouring, a thin stream that widened slightly as it descended and that struck the stones with a soft and irregular splashing sound. The water had been confined within the dark interior of the cast iron pipe for the duration of its vertical descent, and now it was back in the open air, exposed once again to the faint light of the overcast sky and the cool and slightly smoky atmosphere of the street. The change from the enclosed pipe to the open channel was a significant one in terms of the water's subsequent path, though the water itself had no sense of transition or of the difference between one environment and another. It simply flowed where gravity and the shape of the ground directed it to flow. The cobblestones upon which the water fell were made of granite, a rock that had been formed deep within the Earth's crust over the course of millions of years, and that had been quarried from a hillside in the northern part of the country, before being shaped by stonecutters into rough cubes and transported to the city by canal barge and horse-drawn cart. Granite is an igneous rock, composed mostly of quartz and feldspar and mica, minerals that are hard and durable and resistant to the wear of iron-rimmed wheels and the hooves of countless horses. The cobblestones on this particular street had been laid some 40 years earlier by a crew of laborers who had excavated the muddy track that had previously served as a road and had replaced it with a carefully graded bed of gravel and sand onto which the stones were set in rows. Each stone placed by hand and tapped into position with a wooden mallet until it was level with its neighbors and firmly seated in the bedding material. The spaces between the stones, called the joints, were filled with fine sand that locked the stones together and prevented them from shifting under the weight of traffic. Over the decades since the street had been paved, the cobblestones had been worn smooth by the passage of wheels and feet and the slow but persistent action of the weather. The tops of the stones, which had originally been rough and irregular from the stonecutter's hammer, were now rounded and polished to a dull sheen that reflected the faint light of the street lamps and the overcast sky. The granite had taken on a darker color than the fresh stone would have shown, stained by the iron from the wheel rims and the organic matter from the horse manure and the fine soot that settled onto every surface in the city. The color was a deep gray with hints of brown and black, and in the wetness of the rainy nights it appeared almost black, a dark and glossy surface that made the street seem narrower and more enclosed than it did in the daylight. The street itself was not perfectly flat, but had a gentle camber, a slight arching of the surface from the center line to the edges that had been designed by the engineers who planned the paving to ensure that water would drain toward the gutters on either side rather than pooling in the middle of the roadway. The camber was subtle, a rise of perhaps an inch over a width of 15 feet, and it was barely perceptible to the eye unless one looked very carefully along the length of the street. But it was enough to direct the flow of water, and over the course of a rainy night, the water that fell on the center of the street would slowly migrate toward the edges where it would join the water emerging from the downspouts and the small channels that had been cut into the stone curbstones. The water that had emerged from the downspout on this row house landed on the cobblestones just at the edge of the roadway, where the camber was beginning to slope more steeply toward the shallow gutter that ran along the base of the curb. The spot where the water fell had been worn into a shallow depression over the years, a small basin in the surface of the cobblestones that was perhaps 6 inches across and half an inch deep at its lowest point. This depression had been created by the constant dripping and flowing of water from the downspout during every rain, a process that had gradually eroded the surface of the granite and the sand between the stones and had concentrated the wear in a single location. The water that emerged from the shoe fell into this basin and filled it, creating a small pool that overflowed on the downhill side and sent a thin stream of water trickling along the joint between the cobblestones and the curbstone. The pool was never very deep because the overflow carried away as much water as the downspout delivered, maintaining a kind of equilibrium that varied slightly with the intensity of the rain, but that remained roughly constant over the hours of a steady drizzle. The stream that flowed from the overflow pool was narrow and shallow, perhaps an inch wide and a fraction of an inch deep, and it followed the line of the curbstone along the edge of the street. The curbstone was a long rectangular block of the same granite as the cobblestones, set on edge to form a boundary between the roadway and the narrow strip of paving stones that served as a sidewalk. The joint between the curbstone and the cobblestones was filled with sand and with the accumulated debris of the street, and over time this joint had become a natural channel for water, a slight depression that guided the flow along the edge of the roadway. The water followed this channel without any deviation, moving slowly but steadily down the gentle slope of the street toward the iron grate that was located at the intersection with the next cross street, some 200 feet away. The speed of the water in this shallow channel was slow, slower than the flow in the gutter on the roof, and much slower than the fall through the downspout. The slope of the street was gentle, perhaps a fall of 1 foot over a distance of 100 feet, and the friction of the water against the rough surfaces of the granite and the sand and the accumulated debris was considerable. The water moved at a pace that was just barely perceptible, a few inches per second, and a small twig or a leaf floating in the stream would have taken several minutes to travel from the downspout to the grate. The water was clear enough that the dark surface of the cobblestones could be seen through it, and the small irregularities in the channel created tiny ripples and eddies that were visible if one looked very closely, but that disappeared into the general flow when viewed from a distance. The channel was not empty of obstacles. The street had been accumulating the detritus of city life for days and weeks since the last heavy rain had flushed it clean, and the light drizzle of the past hours had not been strong enough to move the larger and heavier items. There were small stones and pebbles that had been kicked into the street by passing horses, or that had fallen from the loads of carts carrying coal or gravel or building materials. There were fragments of straw and hay from the stables and the feed stores, golden strands that were now dark with moisture and that lay flattened against the cobblestones. There were bits of paper that had been dropped by pedestrians or blown from open windows, scraps of newspaper and torn envelopes and the wrappers from loaves of bread, now reduced to a soft pulp by the rain and slowly disintegrating into the water. There were the small black pellets of horse manure that had been ground into the joints between the stones by the wheels of carts, and there were the fine particles of soot and ash that had settled from the air and that formed a dark slurry in the bottom of the channel. The water picked up some of this material as it flowed, carrying the finest particles in suspension and pushing the slightly larger particles along the bottom of the channel in a series of small hops and rolls. The bits of paper pulp moved easily, floating just below the surface and traveling at roughly the same speed as the water. The straw and hay were more resistant, their fibrous structure catching on the rough edges of the stones and requiring a slightly stronger flow to dislodge them. The small stones and pebbles moved only very slowly, if at all, and many of them had been in the same spot for weeks or months, gradually working their way down into the sand of the joint until they became part of the permanent fabric of the street. The water flowed around these obstacles with the same patience it had shown in the gutter on the roof, dividing and rejoining and finding the path of least resistance toward the lower end of the street. The sound of the water in the street channel was a soft and intermittent trickle, a sound that was barely audible over the steady hiss of the rain falling on the rooftops and the cobblestones and the occasional distant sounds of the city at night. It was a sound that belonged to rainy nights, and that would disappear as soon as the rain stopped and the channel dried out, leaving only the dark and quiet street and the faint smell of wet stone and coal smoke. The residents of the row houses were accustomed to this sound, and it did not disturb their sleep any more than the ticking of a clock or the creaking of the floorboards disturbed them. It was simply part of the background of their lives, a small and unremarkable detail of the world they inhabited. The water continued its slow progress along the edge of the street, passing the fronts of the neighboring row houses. Each house had its own downspout and its own small pool and channel, and as the water flowed it was joined by the contributions from these other downspouts, small streams that merged with the main channel and increased its volume and its speed slightly. The channel grew from a narrow trickle to a broader and more substantial flow, though it was still far from being a stream in any meaningful sense. It was perhaps 2 inches wide and half an inch deep, and it moved with a gentle and unhurried purpose toward the lower end of the street where the iron grate awaited. The iron grate was set into the cobblestones at the corner of the intersection, a rectangular frame of cast iron that surrounded a series of parallel bars spaced about an inch apart. The grate was designed to allow water to pass through while preventing larger debris and the feet of pedestrians from falling into the drain below. The bars were worn smooth by the passage of countless wheels and feet, and by the constant flow of water over their surfaces, and the iron had developed the same dark brown patina of rust and soot that characterized all the ironwork in the city. The spaces between the bars were partly clogged with the same debris that had accumulated in the street channel, a mat of wet leaves and paper pulp and straw that had been washed down by the rain and that now formed a partial barrier to the flow. But the water found its way through the gaps, seeping and trickling between the bars and dropping into the darkness of the drain below. The transition from the open channel of the street to the enclosed drain was another significant change in the water's journey. The sound of the water changed from the soft trickle of the street channel to a faint and hollow dripping as it fell through the grate and into the space below. The light from the overcast sky and the faint glow of the street lamps disappeared, and the water entered a region of complete darkness, where the only illumination was the faint phosphorescence of certain minerals or the occasional glow of a distant gas leak that would never be noticed or investigated. The water had left the surface of the city and was now entering the hidden world of the sewers and drains, the network of brick and stone conduits that carry the city's water and waste away to the harbour and the sea. That hidden world, quiet and dark and slow-moving, would be the setting for the next part of the journey. A part that would take the water deeper into the earth and farther from the sky from which it had come. The water passed between the iron bars of the grate and fell into the space below, a space that was dark and cool and filled with the faint sound of dripping and the more distant sound of a slow and steady flow. The fall was not a long one, perhaps 2 or 3 feet from the level of the street to the bottom of the catch basin that lay beneath the grate, but it was enough to separate the water from the open air and the faint light of the overcast sky and to deliver it into the enclosed world of the city's drainage system. The catch basin was a small chamber built of brick and lined with a layer of cement render that had been troweled smooth many years ago, and that was now darkened with the accumulated residue of countless rains. The bottom of the basin was covered with a layer of sediment that had settled out of the water as it paused briefly in this small space before continuing its journey, a layer of fine sand and silt and the heavier particles that had been washed down from the street and that were too dense to remain in suspension. The water that fell through the grate splashed softly onto this sediment and then flowed toward the opening at the bottom of the basin, a circular hole that led into the main sewer pipe. The sewer pipe into which the water now flowed was a conduit of brick, roughly egg-shaped in cross-section, and large enough that a grown man could have walked through it if he had been willing to stoop slightly and to endure the darkness and the smell and the knowledge of what else flowed through these channels. The egg shape was not an aesthetic choice, but a practical one, based on the understanding that a narrow bottom would concentrate the flow during dry weather and keep the channel clear of sediment, while the wider upper section would provide capacity for the larger volumes of water that came during storms. The engineer who had designed this sewer some 30 years earlier had studied the principles of hydraulics and sanitation as they were understood in the middle years of the 19th century, and he had specified the dimensions and the materials and the gradients with care, knowing that his work would lie buried beneath the streets for decades or centuries, and that its success or failure would be measured by the health of the city above. The bricks that formed the sewer were a common red brick of the kind that was produced in vast quantities in the kilns that lined the canals on the outskirts of the city. They were made from the local clay, a reddish-brown material that was rich in iron oxides and that fired to a hard and durable ceramic, and they were laid in a pattern of alternating headers and stretchers that locked the structure together and distributed the weight of the earth above. The mortar between the bricks was a mixture of lime and sand, the same basic formula that had been used by builders for thousands of years, and it had been applied with a careful trowel by the hands of bricklayers who had learned their trade from their fathers and who would pass it on to their sons. The mortar had hardened over the years and had developed small cracks and fissures where the ground had settled or where the roots of street trees had pressed against the outside of the pipe, and through these tiny openings a small amount of groundwater seeps into the sewer, adding its own contribution to the flow. The interior surface of the brick sewer was not smooth like the cast iron of the downspout or the polished granite of the cobblestones. The bricks had a slight texture from the sand that had been used to strike the molds, a fine roughness that was invisible to the eye but that could be felt by the water as it flowed past. The mortar joints were slightly recessed where the pointing had eroded over time, creating small channels and pockets where water could linger and where sediment could accumulate. And in the decades since the sewer had been built, a new layer had begun to form on the interior surface, a layer of mineral deposits that were the result of chemical reactions between the water and the materials of the pipe and the gases that filled the space above the flow. These deposits were primarily calcium carbonate, the same white mineral that forms stalactites in caves and scale in tea kettles. The water that flowed through the sewer contained dissolved calcium and bicarbonate ions that had been picked up from the soil and the rocks over which it had passed, and when this water came into contact with the air in the sewer, some of the dissolved carbon dioxide escaped into the atmosphere, causing the calcium carbonate to precipitate out of solution and adhere to the walls. The process was slow, a fraction of a millimeter per year, but it had been going on for 3 decades, and the deposits had accumulated to a noticeable thickness in places, forming a pale crust that covered the red of the bricks and the grey of the mortar. In some areas, the deposits had grown into small rounded knobs and ridges that looked like the beginnings of the stalactites that would have formed if the sewer had been a natural cave and if the water had been allowed to drip from the ceiling for thousands of years. The atmosphere inside the sewer was still and cool and heavy with the smell of damp earth and wet brick and the faint mustiness of the organic matter that decayed slowly in the sediment at the bottom of the pipe. The air was not fresh, but it was not entirely stagnant, either, because the movement of the water created a slight current of air that drifted along the pipe in the same direction as the flow, pulled along by the friction of the water surface and by the small differences in pressure that existed between the higher and lower reaches of the system. This air current was too faint to be felt by human skin, but it was enough to carry the smells of the sewer along its length and to mix the gases that were produced by the slow decomposition of the organic matter in the sediment. The air was also rich in carbon dioxide from the respiration of the countless small organisms that lived in the sediment and from the same chemical reactions that were depositing the calcite on the walls. The water that had entered from the catch basin joined the flow that was already moving along the bottom of the sewer, a flow that occupied only the lowest few inches of the egg-shaped cross-section. During dry weather, the flow was even smaller, a shallow trickle that barely covered the bottom of the channel, but on this rainy night the volume was greater and the water was perhaps 2 or 3 inches deep at the center of the channel. The flow was slow, moving at a speed that was difficult to estimate in the darkness, but that was probably less than a foot per second, a pace that would carry a floating leaf from one end of the sewer to the other over the course of many minutes. The slowness of the flow was a consequence of the very gentle gradient that the engineer had specified, a fall of perhaps 1 foot in every 200 feet of length, which was just enough to keep the water moving and to prevent the accumulation of stagnant pools, but not enough to create the rushing torrents that would have eroded the brick and mortar. The water was not clear. It carried with it the fine sediment that it had picked up from the street and the roof and the gutter, a suspension of particles that gave the water a greyish-brown color and a slight opacity. If a light had been shone through the water, it would have revealed a cloud of tiny particles drifting slowly downward, the heaviest settling toward the bottom and the lightest remaining suspended indefinitely. The water also carried dissolved substances that were invisible to the eye, the copper ions from the gutter, the calcium and bicarbonate from the soil, traces of the various gases that had dissolved from the air, and a faint hint of the organic compounds that leached from the decaying leaves and the horse manure and the other debris of the street. All of these substances were present in concentrations too low to be measured by any but the most sensitive instruments, but they were there, a chemical record of the water's passage through the city. The sound inside the sewer was a low and continuous murmur, a sound that was made up of many small components. There was the sound of the water flowing over the brick, a soft and liquid sound that was almost like the sound of a distant stream. There was the sound of the drips falling from the ceiling where the groundwater seeped through the cracks in the mortar, a slow and irregular rhythm that echoed faintly in the enclosed space. There was the sound of the air moving through the pipe, a sound so faint that it was more felt than heard, a slight pressure against the eardrums that would have been noticeable only to someone who was sitting perfectly still in the absolute silence. And there was the occasional sound of a small piece of sediment shifting on the bottom of the channel, or a tiny bubble of gas rising from the decomposition of the organic matter. Sounds that were too small to be heard individually, but that contributed to the overall acoustic texture of the sewer. The journey through the brick sewer was a long one, longer than any of the previous segments of the water's path. The sewer ran beneath the street for several blocks, following the gentle slope of the land toward the harbor, and it would be many hours before the water emerged into the larger channels that led to the outfall. During this time, the water moved steadily and without interruption, passing beneath the intersections where other sewers joined from the side streets and where the flow increased slightly with each new contribution. The water from this particular row house mingled with the water from the houses and shops and stables of the surrounding neighborhood, a collective flow that represented the accumulated moisture of a small section of the city, all of it moving slowly and silently through the darkness beneath the streets. The brick walls of the sewer were marked with the traces of its history. There were stains on the bricks where the water level rose during heavy storms, dark lines that recorded the maximum height of the flow in years past. There were patches of a white and fluffy growth that was probably a species of fungus or mold, thriving in the damp and dark conditions and feeding on the organic matter that was present in the air and the water. There were small roots that had found their way through the cracks in the mortar, thin, white tendrils that hung down from the ceiling and reached toward the water below, seeking the moisture and the nutrients that the sewer provided. And there were the calcite deposits that continued to grow, slowly and imperceptibly, adding layer upon layer to the walls and the floor, and gradually changing the shape of the conduit in ways that would not be noticeable for another century. The water continued to flow, carrying its burden of sediment and dissolved substances and the microscopic organisms that lived in the film of water and organic matter on the surface of the bricks. The flow was steady and unchanging, a slow and patient movement that had been going on for hours, and that would continue for hours more, until the water reached the next transition point in its journey. The darkness was complete, and the silence was profound, and the water moved through the brick channel without any awareness of its destination or any memory of its origin, simply following the gentle slope that led toward the harbor and the sea. The city above was asleep, its residents unaware of the quiet river that flowed beneath their streets, and the rain continued to fall, adding new water to the system and pushing the old water ever so slowly toward the outfall and the tidal basin, and the long and patient mixing with the salt water of the bay. The water had been moving through the brick sewer for a considerable time, following the gentle gradient that the engineer had specified decades earlier, and collecting the small contributions from the catch basins and side streets along the way. The flow had grown slightly in volume, but had remained essentially the same in character, a slow and shallow stream of greyish-brown water that occupied only the bottom few inches of the egg-shaped conduit. The sound was the same low murmur. The darkness was the same complete darkness, and the smell was the same faint mustiness of damp brick and decaying organic matter. The water had no sense of distance or time, and it moved without any change in its pace or its nature, until it reached the point where the sewer it was traveling through met another sewer of similar size at a junction chamber that had been built beneath the intersection of two major streets. The junction chamber was a larger space than the sewer pipe itself, a rectangular room constructed of the same red brick and lined with the same cement render that was now darkened and streaked with the calcite deposits that had formed over the years. The chamber was perhaps 8 feet square and 10 feet high, with arched openings in each of its 4 walls where the various sewer lines entered and exited. The floor of the chamber was slightly lower than the inverts of the incoming pipes, creating a shallow basin where the water from the different sources could mix before continuing its journey through the single larger pipe that led onward toward the harbor. The engineer who had designed this junction had understood that the merging of flows required a space where the water could lose its momentum and find a new equilibrium, and he had provided this small room as a place of transition and combination. The water from the rowhouse's sewer entered the junction chamber through the arched opening in the western wall, flowing smoothly over the brick invert and dropping the few inches into the basin below. The sound of the water changed as it entered the larger space, losing the confined and echoey quality of the pipe and taking on a more open and splashing character, though still muted by the soft surfaces of the brick and the water already in the basin. The light in the chamber was no greater than the light in the pipe, which is to say there was none at all, but the acoustics of the space were different, and the water seemed to sense the change in its surroundings through the altered resistance of the air and the different pattern of echoes that its movement created. Into this same chamber, from the northern and southern openings, came the flows from 2 other district sewers, each carrying the water that had fallen on a different part of the city, and each with its own slightly different character. The northern sewer drained a neighborhood of slightly newer construction, row houses and small shops that had been built in the 1870s, and that were home to a population of clerks and shopkeepers and skilled tradesmen. The water from this sewer had travelled a somewhat shorter distance, and had passed over roofs of a different age, and through streets of a different paving material, and it carried with it a different mixture of the substances that water picks up in its passage through a city. The southern sewer drained an older neighborhood, a district of narrow alleys and small manufacturing workshops where the streets were still paved with the original cobblestones and where the buildings leaned against each other in ways that spoke of centuries of settlement. The water from this sewer had a longer history and a more complex chemistry, having passed through soils that had been enriched by the waste of generations and over bricks that had been laid before the invention of the steam engine. The 3 flows met in the basin of the junction chamber and mingled together, their individual streams losing their separate identities as the water swirled slowly in the confined space. The mixing was not instantaneous, but it was thorough enough that by the time the combined flow left the chamber through the eastern opening, it had become a single body of water with a uniform temperature and a uniform composition and a uniform grayish-brown color. The volume of the combined flow was greater than any of the individual contributions, and it filled the larger pipe that led away from the chamber to a depth of perhaps 4 or 5 inches, a modest stream that moved with a slightly increased speed due to the greater mass of water pushing from behind. The water that left the junction chamber was different in several small and unremarkable ways from the water that had entered. The temperature had equalized to a value that was somewhere between the slightly warmer water from the newer neighborhood and the slightly cooler water from the older district, a difference of perhaps half a degree that would have been imperceptible to human skin, but that represented the averaging of the thermal histories of 3 different parts of the city. The sediment load had changed as well, with the fine soot and ash from the row house neighborhood mixing with the slightly coarser sand from the newer streets and the dark and organic-rich silt from the older alleys. The dissolved substances had blended into a new chemical mixture that was the average of the 3 source waters, a mixture that contained copper from the gutters of the row houses and lead from the old pipes of the manufacturing district and iron from the rusting downspouts and calcium from the mortar of all the sewers, and a faint trace of the various organic compounds that leached from the abury of the streets. The combined flow moved into the larger sewer pipe that led eastward toward the harbour. This pipe was of a different design than the smaller district sewers, larger in cross-section and built with a more pronounced egg shape that reflected the greater volumes of water it was expected to carry. The bricks were the same red clay, but they had been laid by a different crew of bricklayers, men who had learned their trade on the larger public works projects of the city and who had developed their own rhythms and their own small variations in technique. The mortar joints were slightly wider in some places and slightly narrower in others, and the calcite deposits had formed in different patterns that reflected the different flow conditions and the different chemistry of the water that had passed through over the years. The ceiling of the pipe was higher, and the airspace above the water was larger, and the sound of the flow was deeper and more resonant. A low and steady hum that filled the dark space, and that would have been audible from the street above if the street had not been muffled by layers of earth and cobblestone and the other sounds of the city. The water continued its slow progress through this larger conduit, moving at a pace that was still measured in inches per second, but that was now perhaps 2 or 3 times as fast as the flow in the smaller sewer had been. The increased speed was a consequence of the greater depth of the water and the slightly steeper gradient that the engineer had specified for this main trunk sewer, a gradient that was still gentle by any reasonable standard, but that was enough to impart a noticeable momentum to the flow. The water moved smoothly and without turbulence, a laminar flow that was disturbed only by the small irregularities in the brick surface and by the occasional obstacle that had found its way into the pipe over the years. The obstacles in this larger sewer were different from those in the smaller district pipes. The larger flow had the strength to move objects that would have been permanent fixtures in the smaller channels, and the debris that accumulated in the main sewer tended to be larger and more substantial. There were fragments of brick that had fallen from the ceiling, loosened by the settling of the ground or by the growth of tree roots, or by the slow but persistent action of the water itself. There were pieces of wood that had washed down from the streets, sections of broken crate, or fragments of a cartwheel or the remains of a broom handle that had been swept into a catch basin during a previous storm. There were the bones of small animals that had fallen into the system and drowned, rats and mice and the occasional stray cat, their flesh long since decomposed, and their skeletons bleached and scattered by the flow. And there was the accumulated sediment that formed bars and shoals in the slower-moving sections of the pipe, deposits of sand and silt and organic matter that shifted and reformed with each rain and that provided a substrate for the small organisms that lived in the perpetual darkness of the sewer. The water flowed around and over these obstacles with the same patience it had shown throughout its journey, finding the path of least resistance and following it without any hurry or any sense of purpose. The larger volume of the flow meant that the water could maintain its course more easily, pushing aside the smaller obstacles and carving channels through the sediment bars that partially blocked the pipe. The sound of the water changed as it passed these obstructions, rising to a soft gurgle where the flow was constricted and falling back to a low murmur where the channel opened out again. The variations in sound were subtle and would have been noticeable only to someone who was listening very carefully in the absolute darkness. But they were there, a kind of acoustic map of the unseen landscape through which the water moved. The journey through the main sewer continued for a long distance, passing beneath streets and squares and the foundations of buildings that had stood for centuries. The water had no awareness of the city above, but if it had possessed some means of sensing its surroundings, it would have detected the faint vibrations that filtered down through the earth, the rumble of a heavy cart passing over the cobblestones, the distant thud of a door closing in a basement, the low and constant hum of the city's collective activity that continued even in the small hours of the night. These vibrations were too faint to disturb the water or to alter its flow in any measurable way, but they were a reminder that the sewer was not an isolated world but a part of the larger system of the city, connected to the surface by the catch basins and the manholes and the cracks in the mortar that let in the groundwater and the faint sounds of the world above. The water in the main sewer was joined by other tributaries as it moved toward the harbour, smaller sewers that entered through junctions similar to the one where the three district flows had merged. Each new contribution added its own volume and its own character to the flow, and the water in the main sewer became a composite of all the rain that had fallen on all the rooftops and streets and courtyards of the drainage basin that fed this particular outfall. The chemistry of the water continued to evolve as the different sources mixed, and the sediment load continued to change as the finer particles remained in suspension, while the coarser particles settled out in the quieter reaches of the pipe. The temperature of the water slowly adjusted to the temperature of the earth through which the sewer passed, a constant value that was cooler than the summer air and warmer than the winter air, and that varied only slightly with the seasons. The sound of the river began to make itself known as the sewer approached the harbour. At first it was only a faint and distant presence, a low and constant pressure that was more felt than heard, a subtle change in the acoustics of the pipe that suggested a larger body of water somewhere ahead. As the sewer drew closer to the outfall, the sound grew more distinct, a deep and muffled roar that was the voice of the river itself, the sound of water moving in vast quantities over the stones of the riverbed and against the pilings of the wharves and the seawalls. This sound was different from any of the sounds the water had encountered before, lower and more powerful and filled with the accumulated weight of all the water that had fallen on all the hills and valleys of the river's watershed. It was the sound of the sea, or at least the sound of the tidal reach where the fresh water of the river met the salt water of the bay, and it grew louder and more insistent as the sewer made its final approach to the outfall. The brick walls of the sewer gave way to a larger chamber, a vaulted space of stone and concrete that had been built at the mouth of the outfall to manage the transition from the enclosed pipe to the open water of the harbour. The chamber was old, older than the brick sewers that fed into it, and it had been constructed in an earlier era of the city's history, when the drainage of the streets was a simpler and more direct affair. The stones were large and rough-hewn, blocks of granite, that had been quarried from the same hills that had supplied the cobblestones of the streets, and they were fitted together with a precision that spoke of the skill of the masons who had built the seawalls and the fortifications of the city. The floor of the chamber sloped gently downward toward a wide arched opening that faced the harbour, and through this opening the grey light of the overcast night filtered in, faint and diffuse but enough to reveal the outlines of the stone walls and the dark surface of the water that filled the lower part of the chamber. The water from the sewer flowed into this chamber and spread out across the stone floor, losing the last of its momentum as it joined the larger body of water that occupied the outfall. The sound of the river was loud here, a deep and constant rush that echoed off the stone walls and filled the chamber with a low and vibrating hum. The smell of the harbour was strong, a mixture of salt water and mud and the faint tang of the sea, and it mixed with the musty smell of the sewer to create an odour that was unique to this place and that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who had ever worked on the waterfront. The water from the sewer merged with the water of the tidal basin, and the long journey through the underground channels of the city came to an end as the rain that had fallen on the row house roof became part of the harbour and the river and the sea. The water that had travelled through the brick sewers and the junction chambers and the larger trunk conduits now passed through the wide arched opening of the outfall and entered the tidal basin of the harbour. The transition from the enclosed space of the sewer to the open water of the basin was not a sudden event, but a gradual emergence, a slow spreading of the flow as it left the confinement of the stone walls and found itself in a much larger volume of water. The outfall opening was located at the base of a seawall, a structure of massive granite blocks that had been fitted together without mortar and that had held back the waters of the harbour for more than a century. The opening was partially submerged even at low tide, and at the current stage of the tide, it was covered by several feet of water, so the emergence of the sewer flow was invisible from the surface and produced no visible disturbance beyond a slight and intermittent ripple that might have been caused by the wind or by a passing fish. The water into which the sewer flow emerged was not the pure salt water of the open ocean, but a mixture of fresh and salt, a brackish blend that characterized the upper reaches of the harbour where the river met the sea. The river that fed this harbour was not a large one by the standards of the great continental waterways, but it drained a substantial area of hills and fields and small towns, carrying with it the rainfall and the snowmelt and the groundwater of an entire region. The fresh water of the river flowed into the harbour and spread out over the surface of the denser salt water that pushed in from the bay with each rising tide, creating a layered structure that shifted and mixed according to the phase of the tide and the strength of the river flow and the direction of the wind. The sewer flow that emerged from the outfall was a small and local addition to this larger system, a minor tributary that joined the fresh water already present and contributed its own small volume to the complex patterns of circulation that governed the harbour. The water from the sewer was fresh, or at least as fresh as any water could be, after its passage through the streets and drains of a 19th century city. It had a lower density than the salt water of the bay because the dissolved salts in seawater add approximately 2.5% to its mass for a given volume, a difference that is small in absolute terms, but that is sufficient to cause the fresh water to float on top of the salt water when the two are brought together gently. The sewer water, as it emerged from the outfall opening, rose slowly through the water column and spread out across the surface of the harbour in a thin and almost invisible layer, a lens of slightly fresher and slightly murkier water that floated above the denser salt water below. This lens was not a distinct and sharply bounded layer, but a gradual transition, a zone where the salinity increased with depth, and where the boundary between fresh and salt was smeared out by the small eddies and currents that stirred the harbour. The spreading of the freshwater lens was governed by the same principles that governed all the flows the water had experienced: the pull of gravity and the resistance of friction and the internal viscosity of the water itself. The fresh water, being lighter, sought to spread out horizontally over the surface of the salt water, pushed outward by the slight pressure difference that existed between the thicker fresh layer and the thinner areas around its edges. The spreading was slow, a matter of inches per minute or less, and it was constantly opposed by the mixing that occurred at the boundary between the fresh and salt layers. Small waves and ripples on the surface, caused by the wind or by the passage of boats or by the tidal currents, broke up the smooth interface and entrained small parcels of fresh water into the salt layer and small parcels of salt water into the fresh layer, gradually erasing the distinction between the two. This mixing was slow but relentless, and over the course of hours and days, the water from the sewer would become indistinguishable from the general brackish water of the upper harbour. The colour of the water in the harbour was different from the colour of the water in the sewer, and from the colour of the water in the sewer channel, and from the colour of the raindrop that had fallen on the slate roof. The water in the harbour was a complex mixture of colours that change with the light and the tide and the season. On this particular night, under the overcast sky and the faint glow of the city's lights, the water appeared as a dark and slightly greenish grey, a colour that came from the combination of the brown silt carried by the river, the green of the microscopic algae that grew in the nutrient-rich waters of the upper harbour, the grey of the reflected sky, and the occasional faint prismatic sheen of oil that had leaked from the bilges of the fishing boats and the cargo vessels that docked at the wharves. The sheen was thin and patchy, and it shifted with the movement of the water, breaking into rainbow patterns that were just barely visible in the dim light, and that disappeared when viewed from any distance. The sheen was a reminder of the human presence on the harbour, the small and cumulative effects of the ships and the industry, and the daily life of the port that added their own signatures to the water. The water from the sewer carried its own contribution to the color and the composition of the harbor. The fine sediment that it had picked up from the streets and the roofs, the soot and the ash and the tiny fragments of organic matter, added to the load of suspended particles that made the harbor water slightly turbid. The dissolved substances, the copper and the iron and the calcium and the trace organic compounds, added to the chemical complexity of the water and provided nutrients for the algae and the other small organisms that lived in the sunlit surface layer. The water from the sewer was a small part of a much larger system, a single thread in a vast tapestry of flows and transformations, and its individual contribution was impossible to trace or to measure. But it was there, and it would remain in the harbor for some time before it was diluted and dispersed, and eventually carried out to the open sea. The movement of the water in the harbor was governed by the tide, the slow and rhythmic rise and fall of the sea that was caused by the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun on the waters of the earth. The tide in this harbor was not a dramatic one by the standards of some coastlines, but it was enough to produce a noticeable change in the water level and the corresponding flow of water in and out of the basin. The rising tide, called the flood, pushed salt water from the bay into the harbor and up the lower reaches of the river, reversing the normal downstream flow and causing the water level to rise by several feet over the course of about 6 hours. The falling tide, called the ebb, pulled the water back out again, draining the harbor and exposing the mudflats and the lower portions of the seawalls and the outfall openings that were submerged at higher water. This cycle repeated twice each day, a slow and patient rhythm that had been going on for as long as the earth had oceans and a moon, and that would continue for as long as those conditions persisted. The water that had emerged from the sewer was subject to this tidal rhythm along with all the other water in the harbor. During the ebb tide, the freshwater lens was pulled toward the mouth of the harbor and out into the bay, carried along by the general movement of the water as it drained toward the sea. During the flood tide, the lens was pushed back toward the river, held in place or even reversed in its seaward progress by the incoming salt water that slid beneath it. The net movement of the water over the course of a full tidal cycle was a slow and meandering drift, a back-and-forth oscillation that was superimposed on a very gradual net transport toward the sea. A parcel of water that entered the harbor from the river or the sewers might spend days or weeks or even months in the basin before it finally escaped to the open waters of the bay, its departure delayed by the shifting winds and the varying river flows and the complex patterns of circulation that characterized the estuarine environment. The brackish water of the upper harbor was a rich and productive environment, a place where the nutrients carried by the river and the sewers met the sunlight that penetrated the surface layer and supported the growth of a diverse community of small organisms. The algae that gave the water its faint green tint were mostly single-celled diatoms and dinoflagellates, microscopic plants that drifted with the currents and that formed the base of the food web that sustained the fish and the crabs and the oysters that were harvested from the harbor and sold in the city's markets. The water from the sewer, with its load of nitrogen and phosphorus from the organic matter of the streets and the households, contributed to this productivity, fertilizing the algae and supporting the growth of the small animals that grazed upon them. The same nutrients that were a source of fertility in the harbor were also a source of concern for the city's engineers and public health officials, who understood that the mixing of sewage and drinking water was a cause of disease. But those concerns were for the human world above and did not affect the quiet and patient processes of the water itself. The water from the sewer spread and mixed and became part of the harbor. Its individual molecules, which had traveled together from the cloud to the roof to the gutter to the downspout to the street to the sewer, were now separated by the random motions of the water and the stirring of the tides and the wind. Some of the molecules remained near the surface, floating in the thin, fresh lens and subject to the warming of the sun that would eventually return and evaporate them back into the air. Some of the molecules were mixed downward into the saltier water below, where they would remain for a longer time before they found their way back to the surface or were carried out to the deeper waters of the bay. The carbon particle that had been the nucleus of the original droplet, the tiny speck of soot from the chimney of the row house, settled slowly through the water column along with the other fine sediment, drifting downward at a rate that was measured in centimeters per day until it reached the bottom of the harbor and became part of the layer of dark mud that covered the floor of the basin. There it would remain, buried by the continuous rain of sediment from the river and the sewers, becoming part of the geological record of the city, a thin dark layer that future geologists might one day examine and identify as the signature of a 19th century industrial port. The night continued and the tide turned. The water that had been moving slowly seaward with the ebb now hesitated and then began to move landward with the flood, pushed back by the incoming salt water that flowed beneath it. The surface of the harbor was dark and still, except for the occasional ripple from a gust of wind or the passage of a small boat making its way to the docks. The lights of the city reflected on the water in long and broken streaks of yellow and orange, the gas lamps and the windows of the buildings that lined the waterfront casting their glow across the dark surface. The water that had been a raindrop, and then a film on a slate roof, and then a flow in a copper gutter, and then a fall through an iron pipe, and then a trickle in a cobblestone street, and then a slow stream in a brick sewer, was now part of the harbor, part of the brackish mixture that filled the basin, and that would eventually find its way to the open sea. The journey was not over, but it had entered a new and quieter phase, a phase of mixing and waiting and the slow and patient drift toward the greater waters beyond. The water that had entered the harbor through the outfall and spread across the surface in a thin, fresh lens was now several days into its residence in the tidal basin. The exact number of days was impossible to determine because the water had lost its individual identity almost immediately upon emerging from the sewer, mingling with the larger volume of the harbor and becoming subject to the same forces and the same slow movements that governed all the water in the basin. A molecule of water that had begun its journey in the cloud above the city and had passed through the slate roof and the copper gutter and the iron downspout and the brick sewer was now surrounded by other molecules that had come from different clouds and different roofs and different streets, and there was no way to tell them apart or to trace their separate histories. The water was simply water, a collective of identical H2O units that moved together and mixed together and responded together to the pull of the tide and the push of the wind and the slow and patient stirring of the currents. The harbor was not a closed basin, but an opening onto a larger body of water, the bay that lay between the city and the open sea. The bay was a broad and shallow expanse, deeper than the harbor, but still relatively sheltered from the full force of the ocean by a chain of low islands and sandbars that lay across its mouth. The water in the bay was saltier than the water in the upper harbor because it received less fresh water from the river and more salt water from the sea, and it was clearer because the sediment that clouded the harbor had more time to settle out before the water reached the bay. The transition from the harbor to the bay was not a sharp boundary, but a gradual change, a slow increase in salinity and a slow decrease in turbidity that occurred over a distance of several miles as the water moved seaward with the ebb tide and mixed with the incoming salt water from the ocean. The water that had come from the sewer eventually made its way into this larger bay, carried by the net seaward drift that resulted from the combination of the river flow and the tidal circulation. The journey from the outfall to the open bay took time, not hours, but days, and perhaps weeks, depending on the exact path the water followed and the strength of the river flow and the phase of the moon that governed the tides. The water moved in a slow and meandering way, drifting back and forth with the tides, caught in eddies that spun off from the main currents and held the water in place for a time before releasing it to continue its journey. A parcel of water might spend a week circling slowly in a backwater behind a pier, gradually mixing with the water round it and losing whatever small distinctions of temperature or chemistry it had carried from its source. Another parcel might be caught in a faster current and carried more directly toward the bay, reaching the saltier waters in a matter of days. There was no way to predict and no reason to care. The water moved as water moves, responding to the forces that acted upon it with a perfect and unthinking obedience. As the water moved into the bay, its character changed in ways that were slow and subtle. The salinity increased gradually, the dissolved salts of the ocean mixing with the fresh water of the river and the sewers, until the concentration reached a value that was close to the 35 parts per thousand that is typical of seawater. The increase in salinity changed the density of the water and its capacity to hold dissolved gases, and it also changed the chemistry of the water in ways that affected the behavior of the small particles and dissolved substances that it carried. The fine sediment that had remained suspended in the fresh water began to flocculate, the tiny particles clumping together into larger aggregates that were heavy enough to sink toward the bottom. This process, called coagulation, was driven by the electrical charges on the surfaces of the particles and by the presence of the dissolved salts that neutralized those charges and allowed the particles to come together. The water became clearer as the sediment settled out, losing the grayish-brown tint that it had carried from the city and taking on the greener and bluer tones of the coastal sea. The dissolved substances that the water had picked up during its passage through the city were also transformed by the change in salinity and by the biological activity of the bay. The copper ions that had leached from the gutter formed complexes with the chloride ions in the seawater, changing their chemical form and their availability to the organisms that lived in the water. The nitrogen and phosphorus that had come from the organic matter of the streets were taken up by the phytoplankton, the microscopic algae that drifted in the sunlit surface waters and that formed the base of the marine food web. The phytoplankton grew and divided and were grazed upon by small animals, and the nutrients passed up through the food chain, eventually becoming part of the bodies of fish and crabs and the other creatures that lived in the bay. The water itself, the H2O molecules, remained unchanged through all of this, serving as the solvent and the medium in which all these transformations took place, but not participating in them directly. The water was the stage upon which the chemistry and biology of the bay played out, and it would remain water regardless of what was dissolved in it or what lived within it. The movement of the water in the bay was governed by the same tidal rhythms that governed the harbour, but on a larger scale. The tide rose and fell twice each day, pushing water in and out through the channels between the islands and over the shallow sandbars that lay at the mouth of the bay. The tidal currents were stronger in the narrow channels and weaker in the broad expanses, and they created a complex pattern of flow that mixed the water of the bay with the water of the open sea. The mixing was not instantaneous or complete, but it was steady and relentless, and over the course of weeks and months the water that had entered the bay from the harbour was gradually exchanged with the water of the ocean. A molecule of water that had fallen as rain on the city might spend a month in the bay before it was carried out through one of the channels and into the coastal waters beyond, or it might spend 6 months or a year, depending on the vagaries of the currents and the winds and the shape of the bay floor. There was no hurry and no schedule, only the slow and patient working of the physical processes that had shaped the coastline and that would continue to shape it long after the city had crumbled and been forgotten. The bay was a place of quiet and relative stillness compared to the city, but it was not silent or empty. The surface of the water was ruffled by the wind that blew across it, a wind that carried the smell of the sea and the faint sounds of the distant city. Gulls and terns flew overhead, their cries a sharp and intermittent punctuation to the low murmur of the waves. Fish moved beneath the surface, their silver sides flashing in the diffuse light that filtered down from the sky. The bottom of the bay was covered with a layer of sediment that had accumulated over thousands of years, a mixture of sand and silt and the shells of countless small creatures that had lived and died in the water above. The water that had come from the city, now thoroughly mixed and indistinguishable from the rest, moved over this bottom and through this community of life, carrying its small burden of dissolved and suspended matter and contributing its own small part to the ongoing story of the bay. The next transition was from the bay to the open coastal waters beyond the islands. This transition was marked by a change in the color of the water and in the feel of the currents. The coastal waters were deeper and bluer, and they were moved by larger forces than the tides of the bay. The great currents of the ocean, driven by the rotation of the earth and the differences in temperature and salinity between the equator and the poles, flowed along the coast in slow and majestic sweeps, carrying water from distant places and mixing it with the local water in a continuous and patient exchange. The water that had emerged from the bay was caught up in these currents and began a new and longer journey, a journey that would take it far from the city and into the vast and open spaces of the sea. The speed of the coastal currents was slow by human standards, perhaps a few miles per day, but it was steady and relentless. The water moved southward along the coast, following the contour of the land and the broad sweep of the continental shelf. The shelf was a submerged extension of the continent, a gently sloping plain that stretched for many miles from the shore before dropping off into the deep ocean. The water over the shelf was relatively shallow and well mixed by the waves and the tides, and it supported a rich community of life that was similar to the life in the bay, but more diverse and more abundant. The water that had come from the city drifted over this shelf for weeks or months, mixing with the water that had come from other rivers and other bays and other cities along the coast, becoming part of a larger and more uniform body of coastal water that stretched for hundreds of miles in either direction. The molecules of water that had begun their journey in the cloud above the harbor were now dispersed over a vast area, separated from each other by distances that were measured in miles, and mixed with molecules that had come from entirely different places. A molecule that had been part of the raindrop that fell on the slate roof might now be drifting southward over the shelf, while another molecule from the same drop might have been carried out to sea by a different current and was now heading eastward toward the deep ocean. The carbon particle that had been the nucleus of the drop was long gone, settled to the bottom of the bay and buried under the accumulating sediment. A tiny speck of soot that would remain in place for centuries or millennia, a small and permanent record of the city that had produced it. The water molecules themselves were unchanged and unchangeable, the same H2O that they had been since the beginning of their existence, and they would continue to be water for as long as the Earth had oceans and an atmosphere. The journey into the open ocean was the longest and slowest phase of all. The coastal currents eventually merged with the great gyres that circled the ocean basins, vast and patient circulations that were driven by the wind and the rotation of the Earth, and that moved water in enormous loops that took years or decades to complete. The water that had come from the city might be carried out into the center of the ocean, far from any land, where the water was deep and blue and clear, and where the only signs of life were the occasional fish or bird, and the faint glow of the bioluminescent organisms that lit up the dark water at night. It might drift for years in the slow circulation of the gyre, gradually mixing with water from other parts of the ocean and losing any last trace of its origin in the chemistry and the temperature and the salinity of the vast and uniform sea. The residence time of a water molecule in the ocean, the average length of time it spends in the sea before returning to the atmosphere or being taken up by some other process, is measured in thousands of years. The oceans are enormous, and the processes that remove water from them are slow, so a molecule that enters the sea today might not leave it for 3,000 years or more. During that time it will circulate through the surface waters and the deep waters, carried by the slow and patient currents that connect every part of the ocean to every other part. It will be warmed by the sun at the surface and cooled in the dark depths. It will pass through the bodies of countless organisms, taken up by phytoplankton and released again, drunk by fish and excreted, incorporated into the tissues of a whale, and then return to the water when the whale dies and sinks to the bottom. Through all of this, it remains water, H2O, unchanged and unchangeable, the same molecule that fell as rain on the city and that will eventually, after thousands of years, find its way back to the surface and be evaporated into the air to begin the cycle again. The evaporation that will return the water molecule to the atmosphere is a slow and gentle process, driven by the warmth of the sun on the surface of the sea. The sun heats the water and gives some of the molecules enough energy to break free from the liquid and escape into the air as vapor. The process is continuous and unremarkable, going on all the time over every square inch of the ocean's surface. But the rate is slow enough that it takes thousands of years to turn over the entire volume of the sea. A particular molecule might spend centuries in the deep ocean before it is brought to the surface by an upwelling current, and then it might spend more centuries in the surface layer before it happens to be at the right place at the right time to absorb enough energy to evaporate. There is no hurry and no schedule, only the slow and patient working of the physical processes that have governed the water cycle for billions of years. When the molecule finally does evaporate, it will rise into the air and join the vast reservoir of water vapor that circulates through the atmosphere. It will be carried by the winds, traveling great distances over the ocean and the land, until it encounters the conditions that cause it to condense back into liquid water. It might form a cloud over a distant continent, and fall as rain on a forest or a desert or another city, beginning a new journey through a new landscape and a new set of channels and drains and rivers. Or it might fall back into the ocean and begin its long residence in the sea all over again, Another 3,000 years of drifting and mixing and waiting. The cycle has no beginning and no end. Only the continuous and patient movement of water from the sea to the air to the land and back again. A cycle that has been going on for as long as the Earth has had water, and that will continue for as long as the Earth remains a planet with an atmosphere and a sun. The raindrop that fell on the slate roof of the row house in the sleeping city was a small and temporary arrangement of water molecules, a brief gathering that lasted only as long as the drop held together. The molecules that made up that drop are now scattered across the ocean, separated by vast distances and mixed with the molecules of a billion other drops from a billion other rains. They have no memory of their journey and no awareness of their destination. They are simply water, moving as water moves, following the patient and unremarkable paths that waters followed for the entire history of the Earth. The city where they fell continues to stand and continues to receive rain, and the gutters and downspouts and sewers continue to carry that rain to the harbor and the bay and the sea. The cycle goes on, quiet and slow and deeply, deeply boring, a perfect subject for a story meant to bring sleep to those who listen in the dark and quiet hours of the night.